At his press conference, I asked President Biden whether he thought Kamala Harris was ready on day one to be president of the United States. And he said, yes, he believes she is. That's why he chose her. He pointed to her ability to hit the road all over the country, talking about reproductive rights, an issue that's very important to Democrats. He talked about her history as a prosecutor, something that she definitely brought to bear in her years in the Senate, on the Senate Judiciary Committee. But now she has to take those attributes, and the campaign has to take those attributes and sort of refocus the entire message, not just the message of the campaign, but also the message at the convention coming up in just a few weeks. Everything has to change to reorient against someone who, while she has served here in the White House with President Biden for the past 4 years, is a very different person with very different strengths, and that entire campaign machine has to reorient around her.
CBS News is doing a lot of reporting, and I want to make sure we get to all of the new information that is just coming in. Robert Costa, I know you have something new you want to share with us.
Yes. So sources close to several of the people who might be considered possible challengers to Vice President Harris for the nomination, people close to California Governor Gavin Newsom, people close to Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, all saying they're preparing to stand down. They do not believe that Democrats will challenge Vice President Kamala Harris at the convention in Chicago. Already in this immediate aftermath of President Biden's momentous decision, you see behind the scenes Democratic consolidation. The real race will be for vice presidential nomination on the Democratic side. But it is intriguing to me as a reporter, but there's no one at this moment preparing behind the scenes to challenge Vice President Harris.
That's right. Governor Gretchen Whitmer just saying, with Biden out, my job in this election will remain the same, doing everything I can to help elect Democrats and stop Donald Trump. She wrote that on social media, so she will not get in the way of Kamala Harris seeking this Democratic Party nomination.
And my sources agree with yours in terms of not seeing a head-to-head challenger. But the question then becomes, who is the person who stands beside her August 19th at that Democratic convention to seek the nomination in that vice president role? That's where the focus is. Anyone, I was told, looking to challenge her would be committing political suicide to try to go head to head after Joe Biden had been so key in making it very clear just within minutes of announcing he was not going to seek re-election that he was endorsing her. So that's what we're looking at now.
In a moment, let's talk about who those potential vice presidential picks will be. But first, I do want to touch base with Willie James Inman. He is in Delaware. And I know, Willie, you have some reaction from the Biden family. Willie?
Hey there, Nora. Good to be with you. Well, the Biden family is reacting to this seismic news today. Jill Biden, she reposted the president's statement and she put a heart emoji, so sending her love to her husband. We know that the First Lady has been with the president as he's recovering from COVID-19 here in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. We also are seeing some reaction from the president's granddaughter, Naomi Biden, who said, quote, "I'm nothing but proud today of my pop," referring to her nickname, of course, for the president there. And I want to bring up some reaction as well from Frank Biden, the president's younger brother, who tells ABC News that his brother's decision to step down out of the race boils down to his overall health and vitality, but also beating this genuine threat to our nation in the form of Donald Trump. Some reaction there from the Biden family, of course, who have been close with the president and coming to this decision that we are seeing today, Nora.
Willie James Inman, thank you. It is now the top of the hour, 3 o'clock here on the East Coast, and we are coming on the air with this breaking news. The historic decision by President Joe Biden announcing that he will not seek re-election, that he is dropping out of the presidential campaign, and that he is throwing his support behind his Vice President, Kamala Harris. The president, in a statement, saying, "We have made great progress as a nation and that it has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your president. And while it has been my intention to seek re-election, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term." The president also indicating that he will speak to the nation later this week and have more detail about his decision. Let's go now to our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes, at the White House with new details. Nancy?
Nora, you just read from that letter that the president sent and that went out publicly at 1:45 this afternoon. Well, I've just learned from a top White House official that senior campaign and White House officials were informed of his decision right before that letter went out. He said he'd been reflecting on it for the past couple of days and that this information was closely held. We still don't have much timing on when the president plans to make an address to the public. Keep in mind, he's still got COVID. He is isolating at his home in Rehoboth, but I'm told it should be sometime later this week.
And Nancy, what about the vice president? I understand that she was just in Cape Cod at a multi-million-dollar fundraiser. Where is she today? What's happening inside her group of advisors?
She has had to be so careful these past 3 weeks to be out there on the trail campaigning as if nothing has changed. At no point did she want to look like she was gunning for this job or hoping for the president to step aside, and yet she had to continue to be a vigorous campaigner pushing for the Biden-Harris ticket. And I anticipate that she is going to continue to, not want to get out ahead of the president. She has to now launch into a lightning sprint between now and Election Day, and yet with the president holed up with COVID, she's going to want to be very careful until he's had his opportunity to get out there and explain in a more fulsome way to the American people why he has decided to step aside and why he has decided to throw the weight of his support behind Kamala Harris.
Nancy Cordes at the White House, thank you for that perspective and new reporting. Robert Costa is here. Robert?
I've been texting and speaking with members of the inner circle of Vice President Harris. She is now perhaps the most important political figure in the United States. The assumed Democratic nominee, the first female to serve as the Democratic presidential nominee since Secretary Hillary Clinton in 2016. Her team and her closest friends are telling CBS News this afternoon that she is prepared to be the nominee to take on former President Trump at a debate, that they believe she is a strong debater, that she proved her chops when she was on the Senate Judiciary Committee grilling nominees for the Supreme Court, and that she was a prosecutor in California going back to her days in San Francisco. Her inner circle said she has been careful in recent days, but she has also been thinking ahead to the possibility, as these calls and discussions have picked up speed. She expects former President Obama, President Biden in particular, to be out on the campaign trail for her. And there's also a belief right now inside Vice President Harris's inner circle that they could put former President Trump on the ropes, that he has so far in the past few days attacked her on personal characteristics, attacked her laugh at his latest campaign rally, called her Laughin' Kamala Harris. And they believe those kind of attacks, which are personal, will not stick with the kind of swing voters that are ultimately perhaps going to decide this election in the key battleground states.
Robert Costa, thank you. Also with us, checking in with many of his sources, Ed O'Keefe. And Ed, what can you tell us at this hour?
Nora, good to be with you. There is a meeting underway of the Democratic National Committee senior leadership amid the unexpected news, at least unexpected to many of them. There was a meeting going on this afternoon that was designed to sort of put the finishing touches on the convention planning, which is 4 weeks from tomorrow. But they did not get enough heads up, and in this meeting weren't able to at least address this. But we know that the DNC chairman, Jamie Harrison, convened his top brass very quickly. And in that other meeting, when the word came, said he was quite emotional about it. They have put out a statement here just a moment ago, and let me read from this, because these are the people that are going to have to set out the rules of the road for the next few weeks. It says, in part, Democrats are prepared and united in our resolve to win in November. As we move forward to formally select our party's nominee, our values as Democrats remain the same. He says later, we have and will continue to make this case to the American people. The American people will hear from the Democratic Party on next steps in the path forward for the nomination process. In other words, they don't quite yet know what to do. While the president has endorsed the vice president, to Bob's point earlier, that many may be standing down, given that announcement, there's a few reasons for that. One, you only got 4 weeks left. And that's a gargantuan task to try to take on a sitting vice president who's sitting on roughly $200 million, give or take, maybe less than that now, because her name is on the campaign's official title. Technically, a handful of money would go to her. And so she could use that conceivably in these next 4 weeks should she be challenged. keep an eye instead on the race for running mate. There are a handful of governors who I've learned this afternoon have been contacted. The one I know for certain, at least in a reportable way, is the New Jersey governor, Phil Murphy, who is among those fielding inquiries and entertaining them, in part reminding people that he has a foreign policy background, given he was once ambassador to Germany. Others that will be considered include the governors of Kentucky, Andy Beshear, Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, potentially Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, and Governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker is the kind of guy that if he really wanted to could cut himself a $200 million check and mount a challenge himself. But the early word from his staff is they didn't know either. We do now know also, Nora, real quick, that he did inform at least a handful of people before this letter went out over social media. There was one senior party official who said he got a call from someone close to the president, made clear he was going to do this and intended to nominate or to endorse the vice president. So there was some early heads up given to a small handful of senior party leadership responsible for the order of things, raising money, operations, and whatnot. We know over at the White House, however, that many staffers learned about this the way the rest of the world did, over social media. Nora.
And let me ask you about this, Ed, and I think we could all sort of discuss this. It's my understanding, though, that the rules at the convention, President Biden cannot simply transfer the nomination to his running mate. He drops out of the race. There are some almost 4,000 Democratic delegates now that were selected, that were bound to President Biden, that they are now essentially free agents. Now, Biden-Harris is the name of the campaign. She will get the, tens and millions of dollars that have been donated to the campaign. But is there a threat to her getting the nomination?
So what is the situation now is people have run for delegate across the country. And if they ran as Biden delegates, they are now what is called pledged delegates ahead of the convention in Chicago. It's important to note that if you are a pledged delegate, you are elected in our system, but it is by no means legally binding. So to your point, yes, legally speaking, is there an opening for someone to come in on a first ballot vote that is somewhat fluid and say, I want the pledged delegates to walk away from their pledge? Yes, that's very possible. And someone could mount a candidacy saying, I want people on the first ballot to discard their pledge. But this is a political process where these delegates are under enormous pressure to follow through in the faith of the Biden campaign, politically speaking. And if President Biden is now directing his delegates, essentially, to go with Vice President Harris, they could move in a different direction. But there's no one now making a move against Vice President Harris, and it would take a real insider who could pull and yank pledged delegates away from President Biden's decision. And remember, these people who run for delegates are the most loyal Democrats to Biden in the country. So to your point, it is possible someone could challenge her, but not likely.
And you have called this political suicide, Margaret, based on what people have said to you. Who would challenge what could be the first black woman and Asian American to become president of the United States? What would that mean for the disunity that already exists in the Democratic Party? Is there a collective thought that they must now unite as a party in order to defeat Donald Trump?
There is a desire to take this public embarrassment that has been the past 3 weeks of disarray and dispute within the party, and in the next 3 weeks be able to clean it up so that at the convention they can shift the conversation to unity and to messaging. They just saw a very well-orchestrated Republican National Convention and a message of Republican unity there after, during a primary where the Republicans were not united. So the emphasis here from those I've spoken to so far is at least there is the intention to try to make this about issues, to try to make this about next generation, about fresh blood, about understanding, and that there's a lot of focus on who that vice presidential selection would be to join Kamala Harris on this ticket. Bob made a great point earlier in terms of that backbone of the Democratic Party, black women. And that is about really leaning into the strength there, not wanting to in any way undercut the vice president. But they know they have a problem with the working class, the white working class male vote. There is going to be a real focus on trying to bring that in. When we talk about some of these names that are being floated, whether it's the Kentucky governor, Andy Beshear, or the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, those are states where there is this emphasis on can they speak to that vote. You see their possible vice presidential picks. This is speculative at this point. It is going to be Kamala Harris.
Well, it's more than speculative. It's already happening. We're getting reporting at CBS News, someone close to Vice President Harris telling CBS they would like to see Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer picked as the vice presidential nominee. This is one of her longtime allies to double down as a female ticket against former President Donald Trump, who has been found liable of rape in civil court, who has had different allegations thrown at him in many decades. So there's already a feverish activity behind the scenes to get people on the ticket. This is tough. This is a compressed time window, and it's amazing to me how just within minutes people are setting up their camps to try to get on the ticket. But we have to come back to the point. While as political reporters, I'm highly interested in who is the running mate for Vice President Harris. The most important thing now is the President of the United States has said he will back his vice president for the presidency. And the vice president, who is a former Attorney General of California senator, is now likely going to be the Democratic nominee. This is a lot like 1968 when President Johnson pushed Hubert Humphrey towards the nomination. Presidents are using their political capital in these moments.
And what will quickly follow in a sign of Kamala Harris's strength is if the Obamas come forward and say that she is the best person to move the Democratic Party forward. What will the Clintons do next? That would be a way that could quickly send a signal to the Democratic Party that they want her to be the nominee.
Obama's allies tell CBS News there's no doubt he is going to be supportive. Think about this. Vice President Harris got to know then Senate candidate Obama when he was a state senator running for the U.S. Senator in 2004. He would come to California for fundraisers and got to know this rising star in San Francisco named Kamala Harris. They became so close that when he ran for the presidency as a Californian, she flew to Iowa to campaign for then candidate Obama. They are close personal friends. It would be shocking if he didn't go out there again and again for her.
But to your point, Nora, there is concern among some Democrats I've spoken to that this cannot look like a coronation. This cannot look like what happened at the Republican convention, where unity was really sublimating to Donald Trump. There is a part of the party that wants to see this look open, transparent, and have
the Senator Bernie Sanders wing will be watching this all. He has not issued a statement yet, at least to CBS News. Senator Bernie Sanders and that progressive wing have not always had a perfect relationship politically with Vice President Harris. Watch what Senator Sanders and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York do. If the progressives fall in line, it's all hers politically, based on our reporting.
I want to bring in Ashley Etienne. She's the former communications director for Vice President Kamala Harris and is now a CBS News political contributor. Ashley, so good to have you on this historic day. What can you tell us about what is happening behind the scenes where the vice president is at this hour?
Absolutely, Nora. It is an incredible day in American history. I just remember, Margaret's on with you. We were on Face Nation maybe 2 years ago, and the question then was whether or not she was going to be on the ticket with Joe Biden, and now she's at the top of the ticket. So much has changed in such a short period of time. It's incredible, but there's a level of excitement within the party and definitely within her own office. So now the question is, what are the plans going forward? How do we piece this together now going forward in a way that sort of stops the bleeding among these key stakeholders that the party's focused on? One, she's already started to make calls with fundraisers, so that's headed down the path. There's now plans for leadership on the Hill to get on conference calls today, conference calls tomorrow. Does she go to the Hill? Does the president pass the torch officially, publicly, in a way that shows that he's fully endorsing her? These are all the questions now that they're trying to figure out behind the scenes. Does he do it in a formal way at a podium, passes the torch to her? Does she deliver big remarks? The other outstanding question is this: is he going to continue? Is he going to put forth a lot of effort to secure those pledged delegates that you guys were just mentioning? Is he going to get on the phone, and is his team going to get on the phone with those folks and say, listen, we've got a plan. We've decided as a party, we need to be unified. Our unity is our strength. We need to get behind Kamala Harris and move forward and focus our attention on Donald Trump. So what's happening behind the scenes is hyper focus on what are the next steps, and then how do we stop the bleeding among those key stakeholder groups?
Ashley Etienne, thank you. And just moments after I said we're waiting to hear from the Clintons and the Obamas, the statement from President Clinton and Secretary Clinton released, noting that they endorse Vice President Harris and will do whatever we can to support her. The Clintons going on to say in this joint statement, we've lived through many ups and downs, but nothing has made us more worried for our country than the threat posed by a second Trump term. He has promised to be a dictator on day one, say the Clintons, and the recent ruling by his servile Supreme Court will only embolden him to further shred the Constitution. Now is the time to support Kamala Harris and fight with everything we've got to elect her. And then they end with this, the Clintons saying, America's future depends on it. Pretty strong statement from the Clintons throwing their support behind Kamala Harris, noting what many people agree is a historic presidential election, perhaps the most important in generations, and what a wild couple of weeks it has been. Beginning with that disastrous debate by President Biden, then the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, in which he miraculously survives and is barely hit with that bullet, a unified Republican convention, which we all just came back from, and his choice of this younger Senator J.D. Vance, who is from Ohio, spent his summers in Kentucky, and has been picked to try and court the white working class vote. However, there is already an effort underway, of course, to go back and look at J.D. Vance's record. The way he talked about the white working class in Hillbilly Elegy wasn't always complimentary. And so there certainly will be a discussion about that coming forward. And I think the Democratic Party and sources that I have spoken with, the reason that they pushed President Biden so hard is that they believe he was not vigorous enough in his pointing out and debating the record and the rhetoric being put forward by Donald Trump.
That's true. But also at this moment, there's a lot of anger among some of President Biden's closest friends. I can't emphasize enough how they feel he was pushed, and that while Democrats might on the surface be celebrating Vice President Harris's likely nomination in the coming days, there is a lot of fury among those closest to President Biden that he was forced to make this decision under pressure from allies of former President Obama, from allies of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, from major Democratic donors. So expect in the coming days for Democrats to lock arms. We will see a cascade of statements in the next few minutes and hours of every major Democrat likely coming out and offering support for Vice President Harris, unless they're thinking about challenging her for the nomination, which we've reported is very unlikely at this hour. At the same time, watch what President Biden does in the coming days. He will be forceful, I'm told, by people at the White House to be out there on the campaign trail for her, and they don't blame her inside of the Biden inner circle for what has happened. But this is a Democratic Party that's at a fragile political moment. They do not feel that this was played in the perfect way for an 81-year-old president who has battled through so much. And so everyone's watching exactly how statements are made and how people use their time, their money, and their political capital.
Thank you. I want to point out that we are just hearing now from Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker Emeritus, in a statement saying President Joe Biden is a patriotic American who has always put our country first. In her words, his legacy of vision, values, and leadership make him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. She has not endorsed Kamala Harris in this statement, but notably praising the legacy of Joe Biden and applauding his decision to put our country first. We are now joined by the co-chair of the Biden-Harris campaign, Senator Chris Coons. Senator, thank you for joining us.
Great to be on with you. This is a critical moment in American history. And I hope today that we can focus on Joe Biden's incredible legacy of service to our nation. 50 years. He has been serving us in the Senate as vice president, as president. And today he's made a very difficult decision in the best interest of our nation to continue serving as president, to continue rolling up his sleeves and tackling the challenges that still lie ahead of us in the next 6 months, but to step aside in terms of the nomination of my party for president in order to make certain that Donald Trump is not returned to the White House. I admire, I respect, I love Joe Biden. I have worked my heart out for him on this campaign. And while this was a very hard decision, I deeply respect how it is a continuation of his lifetime of putting our country before himself. Joe Biden is the toughest fighter I've ever met. Every time he's been knocked down, he's always got up again. And the challenge of seeing this moment and of recognizing what was in the best interest of the nation was a significant challenge. I still believe he could have beaten Donald Trump, but I also know that what he's done today is in the best interests of our nation.
And Senator, what now is happening with Vice President Harris? When will we hear next from her?
I don't know her schedule today or when she'll come on TV, but what matters is that President Biden has made an historic, a brave and important decision that we should reflect on his legacy and his leadership, which is the legacy of the Biden-Harris administration. As you know, I'm a member of the Judiciary Committee. We've confirmed more than 200 federal judges under the Biden-Harris administration. Vice President Harris, who served with me in the Senate on the Judiciary Committee, was a critical part of getting every one of those judges confirmed. She's been a key part of the successes at home and abroad of the Biden-Harris legacy, and I think she is best positioned to carry it forward. Joe Biden, our president, spoke to that just moments ago in endorsing her. I do hope that we'll take some time today and reflect on the fact that Joe Biden is someone who in the Senate, as vice president, as president, has earned a legacy among the most important, impactful, effective presidents in our entire nation's history. And there's lots more to do. Just this coming week, he will continue to work to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza, a hostage release and return, a path forward for the resolution of the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians in Gaza. He is someone who spent 50 years being prepared to lead our nation in this moment in Ukraine and with our NATO allies, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East. And he's got 6 more months of service to complete as our president and as the most respected, most senior leader of our party.
Senator,
I look forward to campaigning hard alongside him this fall and to working with him in the Senate.
Senator, at this hour, we know that President Biden has endorsed his vice president to be the Democratic nominee. We have also heard from the Clintons in a joint statement saying they would like Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee. Do you expect there to be any challenge to the vice president?
Well, today I think we should focus on the legacy of Joe Biden as president. I do recognize the urgency of the moment. As we head towards our convention in Chicago in August, I think the most important thing we can do is come together. And Vice President Harris has an incredible legacy of success and accomplishment as a senator and vice president. I do not expect a serious challenge to her nomination, but let's let that work itself out in the coming weeks and focus today on what a big contribution to our nation our president has made. He's been my mentor. He's been my friend. I am proud of him as a Delawarean, a Democrat, and an American. And I hope the folks who have been raising lots of questions and issues in the last few weeks will do what they said they would do and recognize his leadership, his legacy, and come together to support the nominee of the Democratic Party so that we come out of Chicago united. Donald Trump is a unique threat to the future of our nation. And his choice of a running mate is someone who I've served with in the Senate and who I think in terms of our continuing to stand strong behind Ukraine in their fight for freedom, to continue to advocate for the rights and liberties of Americans, shows everything we need to know. We should be focusing on the fall campaign and the threat that Donald Trump presents to the real legacy of accomplishment, fighting for the middle class, reducing prescription drug prices, combating climate change, helping veterans. Our president and vice president have gotten incredible things done. They've gotten them done through bipartisanship, too. They've reached across the aisle. They've crafted incredible legislation that's made a difference in everything from gun safety to combating climate change to investing in manufacturing to rebuilding this country. So for everyone who's watching, anxious, concerned about the future of our country, know that Joe Biden is a patriot who loves our nation, and know that we are positioned to carry that legacy forward this fall.
Senator Coons, it's Bob Costa. Good to see you, sir. If you could, for a moment, good to see you, respectfully put aside your role as a United States senator and talk about Joe Biden, the president of the United States. You, more than anyone perhaps I've ever covered, understand his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. This is a retreat he goes to. The final days of this decision was not like Nixon in '74 at the residence of the White House. He went to Rehoboth Beach, your home state, to be with Jill, to talk with family members. Tell us about the importance of the site of this momentous decision in American political history. Him watching the waves at Rehoboth Beach, down the street from the boardwalk and the ice cream stands, a place that he has gone to again and again, decade after decade, after personal highs, political humiliation. He always goes back to Rehoboth, back to Delaware, back to the family. And I know this was a heart-wrenching decision for him based on our reporting, but you're one of his closest friends in American politics. Give us a candid assessment of what this has really been like for him.
Bob, as you say, Joe Biden is grounded. He's grounded in his faith, in his family, and in our state. Excuse me. I'm sorry. This was a very difficult decision, and one that I think reflects the very best of who Joe Biden is. Someone who, as you put it, Bob, comes home because it's where his strength is. His strength is in his family. His strength is in our community. His strength is in his faith. And as he was going through the excruciating loss of his beloved son, Beau, it was in Rehoboth, in Wilmington, in prayer, and surrounded by all who have loved and supported him for decades in Delaware that he found strength. As he was finding his way through the tragic loss of his wife and daughter back in 1972 that began his career in the Senate, it was in Delaware, and it was in his faith that he found the grounding and the strength to be able to get back up and continue. And in every chapter in his life, in politics, in service, in his family, and at home, he's been grounded. Joe Biden, more than anyone I've ever known, speaks to what is best in the American spirit, a capacity to keep going, to see challenges, but to find hope and to find strength. The folks in Delaware who've been texting me and calling me in the last few hours all want me to say to Joe Biden how much we love him, how much we admire and respect his service, and how grateful we all are for the decisions he's made over decades in his service and his tireless loyalty to our home state of Delaware. He is the greatest Delawarean in our history. And the fact that he has chosen to be grounded in our community, in our parish, in our parishes, in the traditions and history of bipartisanship and of respecting each other and of being compassionate and decent, all of that comes from our community, his family, his faith, and our traditions. And so thank you for asking. He did make the hardest decision, I suspect, of his whole life in a way that was informed by and grounded by everything that has sustained him in his decades of public service.
Senator Coons, it's Margaret Brennan, and I appreciate your emotion talking about your friend and doing so in a way that really speaks to his legacy. I'm wondering, as you talk about how painful this decision was, this was a painful and drawn out 3 weeks where it was death by 1,000 cuts. And he was being urged publicly to make the decision he ultimately came to. I wonder if you have any insight into what ultimately shifted for him. Was it hearing that he had lost the faith of some of the Democratic leadership? Was it numbers in Congress and losing races? Or was it ultimately something within him that said, this is not my moment? Do you have any insight into what changed overnight?
Look, Margaret, I shouldn't get into details where I'd be speaking for our president. But I will say this. He is someone who has always fought hard. He is tough. He is a fighter. He has survived blows that would have leveled any lesser man. And so in the last few weeks, he has struggled with that instinct, that toughness, that determination to keep fighting and to keep showing what America's all about. If you read his letter that he put out today, he said he's more optimistic today than he's ever been about our nation, that together, if we unite, there's nothing we cannot do. And I think there was a tough balance there. He listened, he heard input from average folks, from folks who've loved and supported him from decades, from folks, of course, in the political spectrum all across our country. He dedicated a lot of time to listening to senators, to mayors, to House members, to governors, to advisors, to friends. But at the end of the day, I think what really mattered more than anything else was his confidence that this was the right thing for our nation. Joe Biden has always put our country first, and his ability to keep fighting these next 6 months to get things right on the world stage, to address the tragedy and the conflict in Gaza with Israel, to secure freedom for the people of Ukraine as they continue to fight Russian aggression, to put some finishing touches on critical work in the Indo-Pacific, and to do that while also leading a campaign effort for the Democratic nominee. I think that opportunity to keep fighting for the things that matter ultimately won out over he personally being the nominee of our party. This is a momentous, a difficult, and a heartfelt decision, and I deeply respect how he made it.
Senator Chris Coons, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And it is now 3:30 on the East Coast. And just to update everyone who is just joining us, President Biden has made the decision to drop out of the 2024 presidential contest. This happened at about 1:45 Eastern time, so almost 2 hours ago, of informing his campaign team just a minute before he put this statement out, where he said, "It has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your president. And while it has been my intention to seek re-election, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term." President Biden has also endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, to be the Democratic nominee. And we have also heard from the Clintons in a joint statement saying they endorse the vice president to become the nominee because, in their words, America's future depends on it. They say they have been through many ups and downs, but the Clintons saying nothing has made us more worried for our country than the threat posed by a second Trump term. I want to bring in Ed O'Keefe, who covers the White House as well. And this has been a difficult decision for President Biden, who has been described as very angry as he is still recovering from COVID at his home in Delaware. What ultimately moved him to make this decision?
Well, we're still trying to figure out exactly what it was, but there were obviously a collection of things that were occurring. And the latest that had come essentially in the overnight hours is the fact that money was becoming an issue. Donald Trump now has more money on hand than Joe Biden does in his campaign coffers. And so that was a signal that after weeks of hearing that donors were withholding large sums of money, not only to his campaign, but to the various super PACs that run ads and try to find people across the country to turn out and vote, that it was going to become difficult to keep the lights on, conceivably, in the coming weeks and to pay for the advertising and the travel and the staffing necessary across the country. So that was another factor that had emerged just in the last day, essentially. We don't know that that is necessarily the one, but it is a big data point that affects any candidate when they're in the crunch if they start to see money issues. This appears to be becoming a conversation about how do we formally nominate her, the vice president, and then who do we pick as her running mate? There are no indications yet, and Bob has reported this as well, that there are no others currently planning to step up and challenge her after the president said what he said this afternoon, endorsing his running mate. But there will be a conversation about who is most palatable, who makes the most sense to be on the ticket with her. We've heard about a handful of governors, some senators as well across the country from key swing states that could conceivably help. We've seen some statements from some of those that had raised concerns about the president in recent days. Let's look at this list, for example, here. You have the Kentucky governor, Andy Beshear, the Illinois governor, J.B. Pritzker, the Michigan governor, Gretchen Whitmer, the North Carolina governor, Roy Cooper. Those four right there are seen as potential good ones because they have executive experience. They've run modestly sized states, or in the case of Andy Beshear, won re-election as a Democrat in a red state, and are seen as the kind of person who can be sent out to campaign with the Senate and House candidates who for the last 3 weeks have been saying they can't campaign alongside the president. Others on that list, Mark Kelly from Arizona would be an interesting pick, the former astronaut from a swing state. There's a Democratic governor who could replace him, what might deliver a much-needed battleground state. Those are the kinds of conversations going on right now with Democrats.
Well, certainly the same still exists today about that blue wall that the Democrats, assuming that Vice President Kamala Harris could carry the same states that they did in the last election, the most contested ones being the blue wall, giving Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania very popular in that state and popular with people who voted for Trump. So his name also at the top there. Robert Costa.
Nora, I just stepped off set for a few minutes to get calls from a couple of the people closest to President Biden and some fascinating new details to share with you. This was, in the minds of, in the words of his closest advisors, a, quote, presidential decision. That's how he frames a lot of things in his presidency. And he did it very much alone. Yes, he conferred with some of his family members and advisors, but he has been in isolation in his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. He has been exhausted in recent days. He has been monitoring the polls, including one from the Detroit Free Press. The weight of this all, as he's been coughing all weekend alone, has been enormous on his shoulders. He has felt wounded at times from how fellow Democrats, including from the Obama-Biden administration, have talked about him publicly, how he feels pressured to get out of the race. But he kept this decision extremely close. His son Hunter, reportedly in California, not in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, this weekend. He's talking to his sister Valerie, talking, of course, to the First Lady, Jill Biden. And they have all said to him in recent days, you do what's best for you. This is your decision to make. And he has been alone because of COVID, not because he wants to be alone. He's actually been in a pretty salty mood, I've been told, because of COVID, and he doesn't have the ability to use his phone as much or have the kind of meetings he wants to have. But there have been some key people who have really helped him with this decision to think it through. Mike Donnellan, who goes back decades with him, one of his longtime trusted advisors. They always say Donnellan is like a parish priest. He never speaks. He has this kind of kind demeanor. He almost never speaks in meetings. He only speaks to Biden. He has that kind of relationship, doesn't speak to other advisors because it could trickle out. President Biden, I'm told by his closest advisors, has been angry about the leaks, about anger towards him, about his electability. He has also made clear to people privately that Vice President Harris needs to be fully supported. And they're watching in the coming days. Not only does President Biden address the country, but will she address the country in some capacity? Now, it's unusual for a vice president to have a national address, but she could make some sort of major speech that's not formal with the office of the vice presidency, but a political speech to reintroduce herself to the country. And as late as yesterday evening, some of the people closest to Biden still believe the decision was fluid, was being active, that this is something that came together with 3 or 4 people in the last 6 to 12 hours.
And that I can confirm, having reached out to some of the folks who even this morning, like Cedric Richmond on our air, on Face the Nation this morning, coming out and backing Joe Biden, saying he is staying in this race. I've reached out to others from the campaign who said they were also surprised because they went out in fight mode this morning saying he's dedicated, he's not giving up. It was news to them when this was announced. You know, when it comes to the vice president, Nora, it's important to remember, this isn't the first time the question has been asked, is she ready? This was an 81-year-old president. Every single interview Kamala Harris has done, she's been asked, are you ready? Because she was a heartbeat away, and that meant something for an 81-year-old president. I was just looking at my last interview with her, and she said, yes, I am, if necessary, but Joe Biden's going to be fine. That was last September. That's how long we've been talking about Joe Biden's age as a factor in this election and a worry for the electorate. But during the Democratic primary process, we were told, put that aside. The public was told it is not a factor in his viability. And yet, 3 weeks ago, that changed completely at the debate. We watched it. We covered it in that moment, and the ground shifted.
It's an excellent point about how much has changed in such a short period of time. And now, while Kamala Harris has been endorsed by the president, by the Clintons, by a number of other top governors say they will not challenge her at this hour, there is still a test that presents itself when running for president of the United States. There is no sharper spotlight than a presidential race. It does things to people. It changes them. It changes people's views of them. No matter how qualified you are, people have stereotypical views. It is a tough grinder to run for president of the United States. She has the benefit of having run for president. She has the benefit of being 4 years almost in the vice presidential mansion in the White House side by side. Joe Biden has kept her in a lot of these key decisions by her side, but now this will test her and those around her in a way that she's not been tested to this point.
And she has been on the campaign trail quite consistently over the last several weeks since the debate, but even before that fateful debate. Just yesterday, raising $2 million up in Cape Cod with thousands of supporters.
And I've been watching some of her speeches, and they've been very vigorous.
Yep.
And they have been very tough in terms of taking apart Donald Trump, his second term, Project 2025, which is not associated with the Trump campaign, but there are strong ties between former Trump officials and this heritage project, which many people view as a dark turn if that were to become part of a new administration. So she has been at the front of prosecuting the case against Donald Trump, but much of her speeches have not been covered either on local or national news.
Well, I've traveled with her in recent weeks on Air Force Two to see her up close as a political athlete. What's she like? And let me tell you this, based on my reporting, she is not the Kamala Harris we saw in 2020, who was a United States senator running as a progressive favorite for the presidency. Where did I see her in Philadelphia, Nora? In union halls, meeting with older union leaders, union workers. She's going to the Biden coalition and saying, I'm your voice. The Sean Fains of the world at the UAWs, the Philadelphia labor leaders, the labor leaders and workers in Atlanta, Georgia, these key states. This is someone who is saying, I am going to have a broader reach than everyone believes in American politics. I'm not just this progressive from California. I am someone who has adopted the Biden political playbook, and I'm here to use that to win in 2024.
And as the conversation about the vice president continues and we ask the question of what's next and how are things being put together here, the political arm of the Congressional Black Caucus just made it official and is now endorsing her. That gives you a sense of how things are coalescing quite quickly. Earlier this hour, Emily's List, which of course is the...
I don't necessarily know that that was going to be the case, given the fact that there have been dozens of people on Capitol Hill, very rich donors like George Clooney and others who have said that he needed to step aside. So this gives Democrats an opportunity now to come together, whether or not they do and whether or not they hold on to states that they won in 2020, or even if they make other sort of
You have to say lately, just, that just goes without saying. Surprised Mitch McConnell coming out with a strong message like that. Obviously, a message against any Democrat would be, one in the pocket for Donald Trump. Surprised by that, or you thought he would have stayed quiet like so many other Republicans, or now former Republicans like Mitt Romney, Liz Cheney, and others?
No, not necessarily, because Mitch McConnell has made it clear whether he has disagreed with Donald Trump over the years, and it's worth noting that very recently the two of them have come together. They've been in the same room. Mitch McConnell has smiled at him and shaken his hand, but it's worth noting that Mitch McConnell's top priority has always been for Republicans to keep the Senate. That's what he's focused on. He's the longest-serving Republican leader in the history of Republicans in the Senate. So ultimately, Mitch McConnell is focused on the Republicans keeping the Senate and obviously trying to win back the presidency as well. So I'm very not surprised that the Senate Minority Leader is coming together to try to unite Republicans against Democrats. So whether or not he is truly on the same page as Donald Trump or not, the one thing that the two of them have in common is their disdain for Democrats and wanting Republicans to take back power.
Back in February, Josh, I interviewed with Vice President Kamala Harris. At the time, I asked the Vice President if she was ready to take up the reins of power. Here's what she had to say.
I think one of the concerns that Americans have about the age is just older people have, more health issues. It's a real thing. What do you say to those concerns? And specifically, if he had to pass the powers to you for 1 second, 1 minute, heaven forbid, and I ask with all due respect, but, are you capable? Are you ready to step into the role and do whatever the country would need?
I'm absolutely ready.
That was a voice of confidence right there. We had about 12-minute conversation, and we covered so many topics that, quite frankly, we're covering, right now her record, her readyability, women's rights, we know, is something very much on the ballot. For a lot of people teetering right now, obviously the polls show what they show. She's around where President Biden was. Talk about her viability to be able to dig out of that hole. Obviously, someone who is younger, healthier. We see Joe Biden recovering from COVID right now. No fault of his own, but, can she get the job done? And what are people saying? Obviously, a few endorsements already ringing in.
So as far as her viability, what we learned following that CNN, now infamous CNN debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, there was a poll that was done to say, how does Donald Trump and how does Joe Biden fare against Donald Trump? How does Kamala Harris fare against Trump? And ultimately what we saw in that CNN poll was that she was within the margin for error against Trump. Joe Biden was not. So that was really the first public reaction that President Biden, his campaign, and the American people could see that potentially there should be somebody else here going up against Donald Trump. Now, polls are polls, and they're not an exact science, but ultimately that was the true statistical information that we could get as far as Kamala Harris's viability. Now, look, it's still an uphill task, whether it is her or whether it is somebody else. You're asking somebody here with 4 months to go until the presidential election, you have got to put together a winning campaign. If I told you that a year ago that somebody was going to take over for Joe Biden on the Democratic side 4 months out and they were going to win, you would say that would be a tall task, and it still is a tall task. And we'll see if she or some other Democrat can get it done, or if Donald Trump is coming back here to Washington ultimately in 2025. You're going to see a number of endorsements that are going to come from Capitol Hill and from some donors. Again, we're seeing from former President Bill Clinton and his wife and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. They are coming out and backing Vice President Kamala Harris. But who is going to be next? What is former President Barack Obama going to be saying? We're waiting to see ultimately what he thinks of this entire situation, because it is very clear that he was not somebody who separated himself from this, that he was very much talking to President Biden, that he was talking with former Speaker Nancy Pelosi about the next steps forward for President Biden's candidacy. So ultimately, there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered here. But when it comes to Kamala Harris's viability, it's safe to say that potentially she's in the same ballpark that Joe Biden was, but what numbers suggested is potentially she could still do a little bit better. But it is still worth pointing out, in that CNN poll, she was trailing Donald Trump. And whether you're trailing by 1 point, 2 points, or 10 points, trailing is trailing. Mm-hmm. And when November 5th comes, trailing means you lose. Mm-hmm. So ultimately is the real question for Democrats is whoever they put forward, is that person going to be able to beat Donald Trump? It really doesn't matter who it is. For Democrats, they want to make sure that ultimately that they can win. And the question will be is who gives them the best chance to win? That is who ultimately is going to be the Democratic nominee.
And Josh, I know one thing you're pretty good at as well is kind of following who's good at what, right? We know the Biden-Harris administration helped lower prescription costs. They helped stabilize the economy. What are some of the things that Kamala Harris can come out and say, hey, I've helped do this well. I can continue to build on this. What are some of her positives? Let's not all look at her negatives as well.
Well, so this is a person that obviously, first and foremost, was a lawyer coming from the state of California. So she has a very deep legal background, as she served as the Attorney General of the state of California before she got ultimately to the U.S. Senate. We know that when she was in the Senate, she was on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And ultimately, one of her moments that gave her national prominence was her back and forth with then prospective Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. If you remember, she went back and forth with him in his line of questioning. That's ultimately what propelled Kamala Harris to a sort of national name recognition, and then she catapulted from there to run for president. Now, obviously, she came up short, but she did ultimately get selected by Joe Biden to be his running mate in 2020, and they ultimately were successful. So now she has served as vice president of the United States for 3.5 years. It'll be 4 by the end of this year. And obviously, her record is his record, for better or for worse. Everything that the Biden administration has accomplished or been criticized for, she will wear from now till the end of time. And so there are things that the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, obviously championed, giving the 5 pieces of signature legislation that I pointed out before, so she can put her name on that. But of course, there's other criticism that have come from Republicans and what have you, whether it's the high inflation that we have seen in this country, ultimately whether it's the immigration situation that we've seen in this country, whether it's the fact that there are wars across the world right now that the United States is trying to somewhat play a part in on the sidelines and trying to help different allies like Ukraine in their war against Russia and Israel in their war against Hamas. So she has all of this. And the question ultimately will be for the American people whether or not they feel that she has played an adequate role in everything that I just mentioned, and if she can improve things moving forward. If the majority of Americans say yes, if indeed she is the nominee, she'll be president of the United States. If not, she won't be.
And you brought up a couple critical points right now. Some of the things, obviously, in America, American diplomacy overseas is that Israel-Hamas war. Like I said earlier, Netanyahu is supposed to be here in a couple of days, addressing Congress, addressing the president, probably now potentially the vice president as well, if for no other reason. The president's health. We don't know how exactly he's feeling, even though the doctor said he's feeling much, much better today. How does this all play, all this chaos going on right now internally with our politics, how does this play out across the world?
Well, look, we can start first with, I guess, the Israel-Hamas war. We do know that the Biden administration is obviously actively engaged in trying to make sure that there is a ceasefire and hostage agreement in the Middle East. That's not going to change whether Joe Biden is president or not president. Obviously, Americans want to see there are American hostages being held in Gaza right now. So the American people would like to see them come back home, and ultimately they'd like to see a ceasefire in the Middle East. So that's going to continue. When it comes to the war against Ukraine, the Biden-Harris administration has been squarely in the corner of Ukraine, giving them billions of dollars here over the 2.5 years that this war has been going on. That's not going to change whether Joe Biden is the candidate or not. Kamala Harris still ultimately supports that as well. Obviously, we know that China is a main adversary of the United States, and potentially whether or not they go ahead and attack Taiwan is something that is front of mind for the Biden-Harris administration. And again, whether Joe Biden's at the top of the ticket or not. So all of these things are going to continue. Kamala Harris has been lockstep with President Biden on all of these things, or at least publicly she has said so.
And Kamala Harris already getting the support from progressives in Congress, but progressives are the ones who have really sank President Joe Biden's polls. When you look at specifically his handling of the Israel-Hamas war, they played a critical part. Many of which I talked to said, hey, we're sitting this election out because they don't like the way he handled that. Can she handle this conflict differently? Obviously, I know you're not in the rooms and things like that. I just know this is a topic you follow dearly. Can she handle this a little bit differently to make sure that she continues to get their endorsements? Because like we said, 4 months is a long way away. And one sign of trouble, they could be back out, and Democrats could be back in trouble in terms of getting votes out in November.
So first, we have to wait to see ultimately what she says first about this announcement, right? Let's start from scratch here. She has not, as far as I've been made aware, she has not made any sort of formal statement on President Joe Biden dropping out of the race. So we'll see ultimately what that statement looks like, whether it's an on-paper statement, a digital statement, or if she comes out and says something in front of the cameras. So ultimately, we'll see what she says, whether or not she just thanks him for his service and that's it, or if ultimately she takes that to say, I'm announcing my candidacy for president of the United States. Now, if she does that, then we can entertain all of these other issues, including what's going on right now in the Middle East. So we have to see how she feels about this current situation. It's no secret 4 years ago she wanted to be president. Does she want to be president now? I think it's potentially safe to say that any vice president who serves would like to be president, but I'm not going to put words ultimately in the vice president's mouth. So we have to wait and see ultimately what she says, and then we'll go from there as far as how she can handle, what she wants to tackle, what her policy decisions are, and ultimately we just have to wait until then. It's not worth speculating.
Yeah, no, fair statement right there. And we probably can't expect her to say much until President Joe Biden addresses the nation later this week, as he promised. Obviously, he made this announcement on social media via a letter, but he did say he would address the nation later this week, probably in the form of a speech or things like that, where we can see him in front of camera. Once again, President Joe Biden is still recovering from COVID right now, even though his doctor did say he's doing much better today. They came out with that earlier this morning before all of this came out, quite frankly. So, it's going to remains to be seen right here exactly what he's going to have to say. Maybe he might even give some reasoning. He might even give a strong report. Obviously, we're in the land of conjecture a little bit just because we're, these conversations are moving fast and swiftly ahead of reality. But, definitely something people were expecting today, but, certainly interesting as we come up here. Josh, also you've been scanning social media a little bit. Some of the reaction, overall, when we look at the scope of reactions, let's just start with the Democrats. Surprised by some of the messaging, or is this pretty much kind of what you expected given the scenario?
No, I think if there's one thing that Democrats have agreed on, it's that they feel that Joe Biden's presidency has been successful. And whether or not they were calling for him to drop out or not, they agree with ultimately what he has done over the first 3.5 years of this first term. So ultimately, when you're seeing these statements come out, The one thing that they are unified on is they're praising Joe Biden for ultimately what he has done here. Now, to take that just a layer a little bit deeper, what they're saying is that they're thankful that he dropped out of the race to give another Democrat enough time to try to ultimately put some sort of campaign here together. Whether or not, again, people have dropped out or not dropped out, whether they've called on him to drop out or not. Then the third tier of this is you're seeing some endorsements for Vice President Harris, but not uniform across the board right now. You're seeing it from enough to where it is obviously a conversation and to keep that conversation going. But you're not hearing it from everyone right now because I think a lot of people are still behind the scenes trying to figure out what's going to happen next. And ultimately, if there are some people on Capitol Hill that would like to see somebody else that's not Kamala Harris, you're not hearing that publicly, but you better believe that those conversations are happening behind the scenes right now. So ultimately, with that said, Democrats are united in the fact that they believe in Joe Biden's presidency to this point, and they are thankful that he has made this decision. They're thankful for ultimately what they say was saving democracy in 2020. But at this moment in time, Joe Biden is not going to be the candidate moving forward, and so we'll just have to wait and see ultimately who Democrats rally behind and if they are unified behind that one person.
And then on the other side of the aisle, I know you came in, you weren't shocked by some of the responses for Republicans, specifically Republican leadership. Overall, what are your thoughts on their responses, particularly attacking Joe Biden, saying, hey, if he's not fit in November, he's not fit now? Also, some of their other reactions.
Well, look, it's not new messaging. So this is something for a long time that Republicans have said that Joe Biden is not fit for office, whether it was about him running for president again or just simply the fact that he's been president over the last 3.5 years. Whether it is somebody who's not in Congress and running for president like former President Donald Trump, he's really never let off that message ever since he lost the 2020 presidential election. And he's obviously going to continue saying that here moving forward because he's trying to get reelected come November. Now, when it comes to the lawmakers on Capitol Hill here, they're obviously unified behind their candidate, Donald Trump, and they're going to do everything in their power to make sure that Trump returns to Washington. So what does that include? Obviously, that includes criticizing President Biden and trying to pick apart his candidacy and his presidency to make sure that Joe Biden didn't get a second term. Now we know Joe Biden isn't going to get a second term, but that is because he is choosing not to run for a second term. So ultimately, Republicans here are going to do what they can to go after Kamala Harris because right now the speculation is that she could be the person to step forward. Hasn't been anointed quite yet, but ultimately they are going to go after her next, and they're going to go after whoever else does come forward, whether just to simply enter their name in the conversation or if somebody else does become nominated to be the Democratic nominee in Chicago next month.
And I know me and you both are going to the DNC, and every day it just looks like the work is mounting on top of us. Obviously, as someone who covers politics day to day, we're up on the Hill every day, at the White House every day. What are your expectations for the DNC? Not necessarily what's going to happen, but just more for the environment. Obviously, hopefully we'll know more about what's going to happen. But, what are your expectations for Chicago?
Well, I think first and foremost, you're not going to hear really anything more about President Biden's candidacy because he won't have it a month from now. He doesn't have it as we're talking right now. And so there was a lot of division within the party because of the fact that Joe Biden was running for office once again. So you're not going to hear that anymore. You may hear maybe some in-person reaction from people you're talking to that you haven't come across here in Washington that are saying, hey, we feel this way or that way about the fact that Joe Biden isn't the candidate anymore. Now, we're likely to get a better perspective at that point in time as to whether or not the Democrats are going to move forward with Kamala Harris, considering she is first in line to the presidency right now, or if they're going to have an open convention. I believe we'll probably have that answer before we get to Chicago. I'd probably be surprised ultimately if we didn't. But with that said, then it'll be ultimately how do they feel about whether it is Harris or whether they feel it is somebody else. How do they feel about that person and their prospects against Donald Trump? So there's a lot of time in between now and when we get to Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. We got to see what the DNC and their leadership says about what they would like to see moving forward because ultimately they control the ship here on the Democratic side of the aisle. But just a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and this is just the first day.
Yeah, it's first day, first couple of hours. We're going to go into the night. I know last weekend, obviously totally different scenario with that failed assassination attempt. We were on the airwaves for hours and hours. This deal, totally different, more on the political spectrum. But, we were getting news quickly, and, it was coming in fast. So I'm expecting to hear some more answers here. Obviously, we're getting reaction from across the board here as we come in. Josh, thank you so much for joining me here in the studio. You've been incredibly helpful. I really appreciate the insight and the advice you're giving. And we're going to take a second to reset at the top just to get everybody coming in here in the 4 o'clock hour. Just about the breaking news that's been going on here on Local News Live. President Joe Biden has announced he will drop out of the 2024 presidential election. He's already endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, as the Democratic nominee. This comes after Democrats pushed him and his campaign team to drop out of the race, fearing his ability to win in November against former President Donald Trump. The president insisted for weeks he would not back down. He said repeatedly he feels he's the best candidate to beat Republican Donald Trump. The calls for Biden to step aside grew significantly following his dismal debate performance against Donald Trump, both publicly and privately. Several Democrats, some high profile, called on Biden to drop his reelection bid. The highest profile House Democrat to call on Biden to step down was California Congressman Adam Schiff. And we know in the Senate side on Friday, Sherrod Brown from Ohio called for him to step down, and also other senators asking the president to step aside, which obviously he agreed to today. And here's a statement from President Biden. My fellow Democrats, I've decided not to accept the nomination and focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president. And it's been the best decision I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. That's current President Joe Biden, his statement that he released right here. And I know it's been a stunning day, another historic day here. It seems like we have them every week now. But President Joe Biden, after he announced the race, we want to, talk more about the vacuum in the Democratic Party that it's created with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor. But as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks and how they sealed the president's fate. Here's Molly Martinez.
A shaky debate performance on June 27th set in motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden re-election campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'll get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The president of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, that I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
And as we recap what President Biden has accomplished in his nearly 4 years in office, Rashida Kaba joins me here in studio as we continue our breaking coverage. And once again, I talked with the vice president back in February. We're going to take a look at some of what she said. I interviewed her, talked about a lot of topics, but mainly, if President Joe Biden were unable to continue, this is obviously a little bit different case where he's not going to finish out his second term. Is she ready to step in and fill that power vacuum? Here's what she had to say.
I think one of the concerns that Americans have about the age is just older people have, more health issues. It's a real thing. What do you say to those concerns? And specifically, if he had to pass the powers to you for 1 second, 1 minute, heaven forbid, and I ask with all due respect, but, are you capable? Are you ready to step into the role and do whatever the country would need?
Absolutely ready.
As you can hear, Vice President Kamala Harris there saying, I am absolutely ready. When she was asked by our Ryan Henson if something were to happen, would she be able to step in? And, there's a lot of reaction coming in, not only from the Democratic side, as it seems like it's very frantic over there. The Republican side also weighing in. Let's go ahead and take a look at part of the statement from the Trump campaign, now switching their energy to Kamala Harris rather than Joe Biden. They said Joe Biden cannot take himself out of a campaign for president because he is too mentally incompetent and still remains in the White House. Biden is a national security threat in great cognitive decline and a clear and present danger to every man, woman, and child in our country. The question then to Kamala Harris is simple. Knowing that Joe Biden withdrew from the campaign because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, does Harris believe the people of America are safe and secure with Joe Biden in the White House for 6 more months? That was a direct quote from the Trump campaign. As you can see, they're kind of not really focused on Kamala Harris. They're still in some ways trying to figure out if Joe Biden did something illegal. There's going to be a lot of questions surrounding this. I've heard a lot of Republican response saying this is not necessarily what we need to be focused on. We need to be focused on Kamala Harris and taking over the White House. I mean, how do you weigh in on that?
Well, that's just been a part of the conversation. Josh was in here earlier talking about, they're going after anybody with the D on their chest, right? And that's what it's all about. If he's not fit to lead in the next 4 years, he's not fit to lead right now. He should leave. Here's Republican Speaker Mike Johnson. He's had a quote here saying, having invalidated the votes of more than 14 million Americans who selected Joe Biden to be the Democrat nominee for president, the self-proclaimed party of democracy has proven exactly the opposite. The party's prospects are no better with Vice President Kamala Harris, who co-owns the disastrous policy failures of the Biden administration as second in command and completely inept border czar. Harris has been a gleeful accomplice not only in the destruction of American sovereignty, security, and prosperity, but also in the largest political cover-up in the U.S. history. She has known for as long as anyone of his incapacity to serve. So that's what it's all about, saying, hey, she knew that he was, cognitively in decline, a fear many Americans have had for not just really this election cycle, but I can remember several years ago going well beyond the election cycle even starting. He just, how old is Joe Biden, for I guess fairness sake, Donald Trump is 78 years old, too. Yeah. He's also an old man by definition of
I always joke that technically they would have been in high school at the same time. These are two older gentlemen, 78, I believe, and 81. As we saw in the CNN presidential debate, that was one of the first times that his cognitive abilities were put on display live for America in this election cycle. It's something that people have been questioning. Is he fit to run for president another 4 years? As you just heard, if you're just tuning in, President Biden stepping away from the 2024 election bid, but Kamala Harris still on that ticket. This is kind of an interesting situation because they're both on the same ticket. So there's going to be technicalities that'll have to be followed up until the DNC and to see if they're able to get on the ballot in some states. You have to think she's going to have to choose a vice president now. She is the vice president. We'll have to choose one.
She's got to become the nominee first.
Of course.
She's getting endorsements right now, and she's only then getting endorsements. Obviously, this happened at about 1:45 this afternoon, so we're still pretty fresh into it. But other names could pop up, as early as this evening, so we'll really have to, it'll be touch and go, and we'll see who else's name will be it. But until she's the nominee, I think then she can worry about a vice president. But she's still, at the moment, trying to solidify her grounding as well, because, not only is she getting, obviously, working to solidify Democrats' independents, who also have an ear to Republicans, who are saying things like this, hey, she knew how, inept Joe Biden may or may have not have been at certain times, this and that. And, once again, obviously we all saw what happened at the debate, right? But, we cover Capitol Hill, we cover the White House regularly, and we've seen Joe Biden, quite frankly, it's similar speeches, State of the Union, other speeches. Literally the day after that debate, he was campaigning somewhere, giving the same fiery Joe Biden that we had kind of all come to know, even though he is at they're 80, dang near 80, if not, you know what I mean? So so, it's just interesting to see, how quickly this thing has unraveled by one appearance, which basically gave validity to a lot of voters' concerns, clearly, and the polls indicate that as well.
Yeah, and while Vice President does have to become the official DNC nominee at the DNC in Chicago in a few weeks, President Biden has come on Instagram shortly after he posted that he was going to be stepping down from the election 2024. He also said, I'm giving my full support to Vice President Kamala Harris. And we're starting to read a little bit more of these statements that are coming in. Let's turn now to the statement from Senator Mark Warner of Virginia saying, quote, President Biden has made historic contributions in our nation. His love of country, loyalty to the American people has been unwavering. He'll undoubtedly go down in the history books as a true American patriot. After all he's done, I respect President Biden's difficult decision to step aside in this upcoming election, and I look forward to hearing more from him later this week. While there has to be an orderly process and the decision ultimately rests in the hands of the DNC delegates, I believe Vice President Harris has the experience, the energy, and resolve to lead our nation. He finishes out by saying this November, we must defeat Donald Trump and his backwards agenda.
And former President Barack Obama now weighing in. We know he's been a critical voice in the ear of President Joe Biden. Here's Obama's statement saying, quote, Joe Biden has been one of America's most consequential presidents, as well as a dear friend and partner to me. We know he was his vice president. Today, we've also been reminded again that he's a patriot of the highest order. Now, it's interesting coming from President Obama, one of the voices that we were rumored to be hearing, urging Joe Biden, hey, sit this one out, hey, step down in the past couple of weeks, especially after that debate. That's obviously when things started to reach a critical turning point for President Biden. Interesting, he says that now. We've also heard from former President Bill Clinton, former presidential nominee Hillary Clinton, and Kamala Harris, we're getting told right now, has given a statement and exactly what exactly she's been, because obviously her name has been circulating a lot right now.
So she says, on behalf of the American people, I thank Joe Biden for his extraordinary leadership as president of the United States and for his decades of service to our country. His remarkable legacy of accomplishment is unmatched in modern American history, surpassing the legacy of many presidents who have served 2 terms in office. She says, it's a profound honor to serve as vice president, and I'm deeply grateful to the president, Dr. Biden, the entire Biden family. I first came to know President Biden through his son, Beau. We were friends from our days working together as Attorney General of our home states. As we worked together, Beau would tell me stories about his dad, the kind of father and the kind of man he was. And the qualities Beau revered in his father are the same qualities, the same values I've seen every single day in Joe's leadership as president. His honesty and integrity, his big heart and commitment to his faith and his family, and love for our country. And she says, with this selfless and patriotic act, President Biden is doing what he has done throughout his life of service, putting the American people and our country above everything else. She goes on to say, I'm honored to have the president's endorsement, and my intention is to earn and win the nomination. Over the past year, I've traveled across the country talking with Americans about the clear choice in this momentous election, and that is what I will continue to do in the days and weeks ahead. I will do everything in my power to unite the Democratic Party, unite our nation, to defeat Donald Trump and his extreme Project 2025 agenda. She says, to round it out, we have 107 days until Election Day. Together we will fight, and together we will win. This is the first time we are hearing Kamala Harris in the past couple of hours since this breaking news came out that President Biden is stepping down in election 2024, that she seemingly is going to accept this challenge in taking over and trying to be that Democratic national nominee. We are 3 weeks away until that Democratic National Convention where the official nominee will be named.
And I know we've been waiting to hear her voice for a while now, a couple hours since this broke. White House correspondent John Decker going to join us right now. John, coming in with fresh info in here. We've heard a lot of statements from a lot of people on both sides of the aisle. Thoughts on Vice President Kamala Harris accepting the endorsements, obviously talking about her intentions to win the nominee and win in November.
Well, she now has the endorsement of the sitting president. She has the endorsement of the former president, Bill Clinton. That goes a long way in the Democratic Party. And what I think you're going to see is slowly but surely other Democrats following the leadership of the Democratic Party, coalescing around the sitting vice president as being the standard bearer for the Democratic Party in November. The Democrats, quite frankly, cannot afford a fight on this. And so the real jockeying will not actually be for the top spot on the ticket. The real jockeying will be to be Kamala Harris's running mate. And you're going to see a lot of well-known Democrats. They have a deep bench making the case that they can best serve in this position and can best help the sitting Vice President Kamala Harris in winning against Donald Trump in November.
Now, John, I know you've been traveling with the president over the years as you are our White House correspondent. You've seen the things that maybe potentially people have been talking about. Did this come as a surprise? We had our ear to the ground hearing that it was a potential that he could step down from the election 2024 campaign this weekend. Does this come as a surprise to you? You've been able to watch the president interact and have interface with everyday people.
Rashida, it doesn't come as a surprise. Pressure had been building on President Biden over the last few weeks. Almost every day, we've seen another elected Democrat come forward and publicly say they would like to see President Biden step down from his position as the presumptive Democratic nominee. They'd like to see him bow out of the race. We've, in addition to that, seen well-known Democratic donors saying that they would like to see someone other than President Biden as the standard bearer for the Democrats in November. All of that pressure was starting to really weigh on President Biden. The latest Democrat being Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. Earlier today, he called on President Biden to bow out. And that's just what's been happening publicly. Behind the scenes, some very well-known Democrats, the leaders of the party, former President Barack Obama, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, the leader for Democrats in the Senate, Hakeem Jeffries, the leader for Democrats in the House, all of them in private conversations, we're telling President Biden, we really respect you. We respect what you've done, but we do not believe that you can beat Donald Trump in November. And we are not only concerned about that, we are concerned as well about you being a drag on the Democratic ticket for the down ballot races that will take place, which will make us so difficult for Democrats to take back the House of Representatives and to hold on to the U.S. Senate.
And John, I know we talked earlier today about momentum. You know, while the Democrats have been in disarray, especially since that debate, you know, Republicans have been speeding ahead, and even more so after the RNC, which you were at. You know, can they be caught? What's it going to take, to catch up to them, and who might need to be on a ticket, whether the president or vice president, to do so?
Well, the bottom line, Ryan, is that Democrats need to quickly come together and coalesce around Kamala Harris. They need to put their differences aside. They need to unite in the same way that we saw Republicans unite this past week in Milwaukee. As you point out, I was at the RNC. It was a very united convention, a very united party. They're jubilant, they're energized, they're confident. Democrats are not in the same position right now. If you look at the calendar right now, there are 107 days between now and the November 5th election. That time will fly by. And as you point out, Rashida, just 3 weeks between now and the Democratic National Convention. So there's a lot of work that needs to take place over the course of the next 3 weeks so that there is not any type of division that takes place during the 4 days of the DNC in Chicago.
And John, I know I always rely on you to be our historian of sorts. You've been covering the White House since the Clinton administration. You know, this topsy-turvy election cycle, talk about, has there been anything like it? I mean, it's literally week to week, day to day, really. It's something new, and we forget about what happened yesterday because there's something else on the horizon.
Well, there have been election cycles that have had surprises before. 1972, one of the candidates running for president in 1972, former Alabama Governor George Wallace, was an individual who survived an assassination attempt. 1968, Robert F. Kennedy Sr. Was killed in an assassination, and that obviously had an impact on the 1968 election cycle. But we have never seen anything like this. We've never seen the presumptive nominee for a major party drop out of the race with less than 4 months to go until Election Day. This is unprecedented, and I think all of this stems from that disastrous debate performance that President Biden undertook last month. That has led to the cascading of all of these events over the course of the past few weeks, culminating in this remarkable decision by President Biden to announce that he is not going to go forward with his quest for re-election. He's dropping out of the race, and he's throwing his support to his Vice President, Kamala Harris, to be the Democratic nominee this November.
All right. The other question I have is that, throughout the weekend, I remember AOC came out saying, a lot of people might be surprised that a lot of Democrats may not stand behind Kamala Harris. Is it likely that the Democratic Party can get it together to maybe champion behind Kamala Harris? Some people are throwing out some other names out there. We've seen the polls say, in some cases, of course, she hasn't publicly said that she is running, that Michelle Obama is the only person that could potentially beat Donald Trump. But Kamala Harris's name is who's at the top of that list. Is it likely that Democrats are going to get it together in the next few weeks and get behind Vice President Kamala Harris?
Rashida, I am not a fortune teller. I can't say with certainty what's going to happen over the course of the next few weeks, but I can say that it matters a lot that President Biden, in that note that he put out earlier today, and in the statement that former President Bill Clinton put out earlier today, they endorsed Kamala Harris. That goes a long way. And I think that what you're going to see happen over the course of the next 24, 48 hours is that other Democrats will fall in line. They will unite around the sitting vice president, including progressives like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the person that you mentioned, who is a leader in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They have no choice. They cannot afford to have a fight. They cannot afford to be disunified going into their convention. And that's the reason why I believe that the sitting vice president, Kamala Harris, will indeed be at the top of the ticket in November. And the real question that we'll have to figure out, and Democrats, more importantly, will have to figure out over the course of the next week and perhaps weeks, is who will be her running mate, who will be the best person to not only unify the Democratic Party, but to win specific states to help in that effort to beat Donald Trump in November.
Not a fortune teller, just our White House correspondent, John Decker. Thanks again for tuning in and enlightening us with all your insight and expertise.
Thank you.
And so here's part of the statement from the Trump campaign. I know we're getting reaction on both sides of it here as we recap and reset that, current President Joe Biden says he's not running for re-election in 2024. We've been talking to a lot of people about what this means next, talking to a lot of people about how they feel, especially members of the GOP. They have a lot to say about what's going on in the Democratic Party right now.
Yeah, let's go ahead and turn now to part of a statement from the Trump campaign. They have reacted to this news of President Biden saying he is stepping out of the race. They say Joe Biden cannot take himself out of a campaign for president because he is too mentally incompetent and still remains in the White House. Biden is a national security threat in great cognitive decline and a clear and present danger to every man, woman, and child in our country. The question then to Kamala Harris is simple. Knowing that Joe Biden withdrew from the campaign because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, does Harris believe the people of America are safe and secure with Joe Biden in the White House for the next 6 months? And as you've just heard that, you have to think he is still the current president, yes. Even though he's deciding that, he just can't take it for another 4 years. It doesn't mean that he can't finish out his job. He has said that in that interview with with ABC correspondent George Stephanopoulos shortly after that disastrous CNN presidential debate. He said that he can still continue to serve, that he wanted to serve, and that the only way he was going to step down is if God himself came down down and said, hey, I want you out of the race. But here we are, a couple weeks later, and we're talking about President Biden stepping aside. A lot of his colleagues in the Democratic Party saying that this is just a show of his patriotism. This is something that he's done his entire life. We know he was once a senator. Now the president of the United States, was formerly the vice president under the Obama administration. And we're continuing to get a little bit more information from the Democratic side. And we want to read you a couple of new statements, one of them being from Senator Peter Welch of Vermont. He's a Democrat. He issued this statement saying, today, Joe Biden made a difficult and selfless choice. There you hear it again, saying selfless. He put our democracy and the future of our nation ahead of himself. For this and for all he has done, Joe Biden will be remembered as one of the greatest presidents of our time. His agenda, which has unified our party, will be his legacy. His ability to overcome personal tragedy has inspired generations of Americans. That again from Senator Peter Welch
and we
of
know,
Vermont.
A lot of people want to see Joe Biden jump into the race in 2016 when it was Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
Talking about some of the tragedy he's experienced. We know Joe Biden lost a wife and a daughter years ago when he was senator. He lost his son, Beau Biden, when he was still vice president as well. One of the reasons that it's been reportedly told why he was kind of told, hey, take time for your family, grieve some. That's why Hillary Clinton took the nomination in 2016. So interesting that he relied on some of that right there too. But it's obviously just an interesting time. We heard from John right there saying, hey, Democrats are going to need to unify, going to need to get together, going to need to come together in the next 3 weeks, especially by the end of that DNC. So voters have a clear picture of who the nominee is, what they stand for, and if they feel confident that they can lead the country, obviously lead the party, and either keep the White House in a Democratic name. So,
all right, and we know how important family is to the Biden family and the Biden administration. Let's turn now to author and Professor Emeritus at American University, W. Joseph Campbell. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, a stunning decision by President Biden today. What's your reaction to today's news?
Yeah, it was stunning in terms of its timing. I think it was probably an inevitable decision given Biden's really disastrous performance 3.5 weeks ago at the debate with Donald Trump. And I think it became inevitable from what we saw at that debate and what we saw even before Joe Biden's infirmities, that there is no way he could stay in the race and continue to be the Democratic standard bearer. And so I think this is an inevitable decision. And if one were really getting kind of harsh about it, it was a little selfish because 3.5 weeks have gone by, and those have been 3.5 tumultuous weeks that have left the Democratic Party in disarray. And we're also in uncharted territory right now, to invoke a political cliche, because Lyndon Johnson was the last sitting president to announce that he was not going to run for re-election. And that was in 1968, in March of 1968. So here we are in almost the end of July 2024, and we're less than 4 months from a general election. So it is really uncertain as to how all this is going to unfold over the next several weeks. It looks like Kamala Harris is probably going to be the odds-on favorite to become the Democratic nominee, but even that may be up in the air for some question.
Time is of the essence. Questions coming in quickly, and you've written about the challenges in political polling, and polls were likely a big factor in today's decision. What were they saying about Biden's chances in November, and where do things stand now for Kamala Harris as it pertains to the numbers?
You're right about the polls. They were certainly an important point in Biden's making this decision, this belated decision to drop out of the race. The polls have been saying in recent weeks that Joe Biden trails Donald Trump clearly, but not in a dramatic way. We're not talking about an 8, 10-point, 12-point deficit here. We're talking something on the order of 2, 4, 6 points in various polls. So that's not a terrible or insurmountable deficit for an incumbent president, certainly, to try to overcome, especially a candidate like Donald Trump, who has his problems too. And Trump just doesn't seem to be able to keep out of his own way in many respects. So this is more likely to be a close race than a landslide. And there has been some talk about if Biden stays in the race, Trump will win in a landslide. Even if that had been the scenario, I don't think Trump would have prevailed in a landslide. So I think it's probably even more unlikely, if you will, now that Trump will have a huge lead in the polls come Labor Day, say.
Yeah, we've seen Donald Trump and his campaign come out and kind of attack Kamala Harris, saying that she knew about his decline leading up into this point of him stepping aside. Now, Kamala Harris has not been nominated just yet. What do you think of her chances in November, and who are some other candidates the party could consider? Because, again, she is not the official nominee. We have to wait until the Democratic National Convention.
That's for sure. Democrats do, though, have a way of nominating former vice presidents for their presidential candidates. And we can go back to 1968 when Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, took over the nomination from Lyndon Johnson, Al Gore in the year 2000. So, and Joe Biden himself was a former vice president. So we've seen vice presidential candidates become or graduate up to, if you will, the presidential slot on the Democratic tickets. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's the way this all shakes out. It'd probably be the most elegant solution, if you will, the easiest to reach. But other candidates are probably out there. And Gavin Newsom of California, the governor of California, is certainly among them.
And you wrote a recent op-ed about Donald Trump and his prediction for a landslide. Thoughts still the same, or have they changed now in light of this announcement this afternoon?
I appreciate the question. It's a good question. I do think it's still the same. I think that Donald Trump's winning in a landslide is still unlikely, and we'll have to see what the polls are showing over the next 10 days or so. And but I don't think that they're going to show that the Democratic candidates or the Democratic hopefuls have cratered vis-a-vis Donald Trump in terms of polling data. I just don't see that. And Trump may be forging ahead in key battleground states, of which there are 6 or 7, depending on how you want to count them. But they include Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, maybe North Carolina, Georgia for sure, Arizona, and Nevada. And Trump, as of now, seems to have a pretty solid lead in most of those states. And those are key states, especially the northern tier states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania for the Democrats. To win those, to be able to nail down an electoral college victory. So it remains to be seen whether Kamala Harris or whoever the successor is to Biden, the presumed nominee, is going to be. It's going to be difficult to see how they're going to be able to put together an electoral college combination that brings them over the top. It's still tough to see that.
Yeah, what's interesting is that, you know, earlier we read that that statement from the Trump administration saying that, you know, kind of pivoting their focus onto Kamala Harris. They now have a few months to start to raise money and make ads that are targeted towards Kamala Harris. And it seems like they're going in the direction of saying, hey, these are the things that the Biden-Harris administration did. How do you think it's going to kind of play out in terms of them being able to find some of the things that Biden may have done or the administration has done and kind of put the blame on Kamala Harris? Do you think there's enough time to shift their focus onto Kamala Harris? Is it going to be easier because she was already on that ticket?
That's right. She's been in the administration, and she, one would argue, has a lot to answer for in terms of the administration's policies and decision-making, especially since Biden had named her the lead, if you will, on the southern border. And that's one of the Republicans' major talking points is how the southern border is essentially wide open. And there have been 10 million to 13 million people who've made their way into the United States unvetted and improperly. So I think that that's going to be a major talking point. It would have been a major talking point had Biden stayed at the top of the ticket. But now that Kamala Harris may well be at the top of the ticket, that is certainly an argument that Republicans are going to be making about her. And I think they're going to know, too, that she did not do terribly well in the primary season in the 2020 election cycle. She dropped out before even the first primary, or maybe right after the first primary in 2020. And so I don't know. Her national political standing doesn't seem to be terribly strong. But we'll see if indeed she is the nominee and if indeed she rose into the position. But time is tight. Time is really, really tight here.
Yeah, time is of the essence. I think this is one of the first times, at least in our recent years, in which this has kind of been, like Ryan mentioned, a topsy-turvy election. And we have a couple more weeks to figure out what Democrats are going to do. Author, professor at American University, W. Joseph Campbell, thank you so much for joining us here on Local News Live and giving us some valuable insight.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Now, obviously, to recap, we're going over the breaking news that came down this afternoon, about 1:45-ish. President Joe Biden announcing on social media that he is bowing out of the 2024 election. He's obviously given his endorsement to Kamala Harris. That's why we're giving her so much talk. Other names could throw their names in the hat as well. At the DNC, could be an open convention, quote unquote, as Josh Rotenberg said. That's how they used to do it in the old days, where nominees would come in and have to vie and really plead their case for why they should get the delegates' vote and the delegates' attention. So that's one thing we're going to be interested to see. We're still going to wait and hear more. We've already heard from the DNC. They haven't indicated exactly what direction it's going. They just said, thank you, Joe Biden, and left it in ellipses, ... So we're still trying to figure out exactly what's next and what we can go from here. But I know we're getting some other statements here from Barack Obama, another former president, powerful voice in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, this is what he had to say. He says, for him to look at the political landscape, referring to Biden, and decide that he should pass the torch to a new nominee is surely one of the toughest in his life. But I know he wouldn't make the decision unless he believed it was right for America. It's a testament to Joe Biden's love of our country, a historic example of genuine public servant, once again putting the interests of the American people ahead of his own, that future generations of leaders will do and will eventually follow. That is from the former President Barack Obama, his former boss. It's interesting to see so many Democrats coming forward, giving their statements, and they have all said he is putting service over anything else, over his personal ambitions, even though despite over the weeks, many Democrats, top officials have come forward and say, it's time, Joe, to step aside. And he's ignored some of those calls. But it seems like, he got COVID earlier this week. Not sure if that had an impact on his vulnerability and just seeing that, maybe his health isn't in as good of a position as it is to continue for another 4 years. You have to think these presidents, they travel for weeks at a time. They're in Italy one day. They're back in the United States. And to do that at the age of 81, I mean, it's difficult.
And it's worth noting, too, former President Donald Trump, 78 years old, so not much farther behind him when it comes to the calendar. But, back in February, we talk a lot about Kamala Harris. I spoke with her then purely as a vice president on the ticket. Now she could be a nominee for the president. I spoke with her and I asked her, hey, if Joe Biden were to step aside for whatever reason, are you ready to step in and fill the reins and take control? Here's what she said.
I think one of the concerns that Americans have about the age is just older people have, more health issues. It's a real thing. What do you say to those concerns? And specifically, if he had to pass the powers to you for 1 second, 1 minute, heaven forbid, and I ask with all due respect, but, are you capable? Are you ready to step into the role and do whatever the country would need?
Absolutely ready.
And that's Vice President Kamala Harris right there. We touched on a number of things, specifically, what her record on the border was. She talked a lot about women's reproductive rights, two critical issues that are on the ballot this year, especially when we look at, both sides of the equation. Immigration's a topic on both, a bipartisan issue amongst voters, reproductive women's rights, a bipartisan issue, whether you're on one side of it or the other. A lot of voters wanting to come out. But, specifically, is Kamala Harris going to give them a reason to come out? The vice president obviously was already on the ticket, but President Joe Biden, obviously losing support en masse by the hour, it seemed like. So, is Vice President Kamala Harris able to pick that up and catch up to the Republicans who are, full steam ahead after that RNC?
Yeah, it's interesting to see, even maybe a couple weeks ago they spoke, I remember CNN spoke to Nancy Pelosi and they asked her, do you support President Biden? Do you endorse him? And she said, I want him to do whatever he feels is best. She would never publicly say it, but we know now that she has had private talks. The two have been friends for years. And I think that kind of shows the kind of weight maybe that Nancy Pelosi still has in the Democratic Party for him to listen and maybe listen to some of the calls of some of his other colleagues to step aside. Despite his pride, we know President Biden is a prideful man. So for him to step aside, he had to have thought that this was the absolute best option. And for him to endorse Kamala Harris, he has to think she's the best option for president.
Yeah, and it wasn't just Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. It was former President Barack Obama. We know he met with President Joe Biden. Majority Leader in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, met with him. Minority Leader of the House, Hakeem Jeffries, met with him. One thing we took away from a lot of those conversations was that they never gave President Biden an endorsement during those critical conversations, as we know, as they were not necessarily asking him to step aside, but they were hashing out a lot of the concerns that many people in their delegation, whether the Senate or the House, had about him, because we know it's not just about the White House. Right. It's about down ticket as well. The House, a lot of critical battles going to be had across the nation, and if you're weak at the top, not good for the bottom of the ticket as well. The Senate, it is basically tied. The only reason that Chuck Schumer is in the majority is because they have the White House, and Vice President Kamala Harris is a record, is a tie-breaking vote of sorts. That's legally, that's her job to do. So, if you lose one seat in the Senate, you could be done there too. It's a lot of bad news coming down. So that's why a lot of people were urging the White House to, not the White House, but President Joe Biden to please step aside so we can continue to remain control and win, so that way these GOP policies don't take
and we
over.
know how critical it is for Congress. We've seen potential shutdowns looming. We've seen how difficult it's been for them to get bills passed. We've also seen how heavy Trump still has a hand, and there's some bills that were supposed to be passed, and President Trump said, don't pass it. And Republicans all of a sudden decided that they did not want to pass that border bill. And so it's interesting to see how so many Senate Democrats, House Democrats, they're all very worried about their seats. Of course, they are the lawmakers of this country, so they want to get the bills passed that they can for their states, for the country altogether.
Yeah, it's going to be a battle. And, Republicans know how important these battles are, too. We know former President Donald Trump, obviously, who is going to be going up against whoever's at the top of the Democratic ticket. He's been weighing in a lot, and it seems like every statement he releases gets more and more, energizing or vigorous, so to speak. He says Joe Biden can't take himself out of a campaign for president because he is too mentally incompetent and still remain in the White House. Biden is a national security threat in great cognitive decline and a clear and present danger to every man, woman, and child in our country. The question then to Kamala Harris is simple. Knowing that Joe Biden withdrew from the campaign because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, does Harris believe the people of America are safe and secure with Joe Biden in the White House for 6 more months? We've heard a lot of rhetoric from them, and we know Donald Trump not the only one talking today.
Yeah, we know Republicans are coming forward, giving their statements. House Speaker Mike Johnson responding today, saying in part, quote, having invalidated the votes for more than 14 million Americans who selected Joe Biden to be the Democratic nominee for president, the self-proclaimed party of democracy has proven exactly the opposite. The party's prospects are no better now with Vice President Kamala Harris, who co-owns the disastrous policy failures of the Biden administration. As second in command and the completely inept border czar, Harris has been a gleeful accomplice, not only in the destruction of American sovereignty, security, and prosperity, but also in the largest political cover-up in United States history. She is known for as long as anyone of his incapacity to serve. This is something that a lot of Republicans are saying. Why now? Why are you just now, weeks before the Democratic National Convention, coming forward? You've had many talks with the president. Most times, I'm sure every day, she sees him. She's on the campaign trail, and she always champions him. So a lot of Republicans are going to have a lot to say. They're going to be critical of her, of the policies under Biden. So the thing about Kamala Harris is, even though if she does become the Democratic National Convention's nominee, there's still going to be a lot of baggage being carried with her. Everything from the Biden administration is going to follow her as well. This is not going to be a clean slate. This is not like if another Democrat might have come in. This is the sitting vice president potentially becoming the Democratic nominee for president.
Yeah, I know. And to answer some of those questions, Eleanor, senior national correspondent Peter Zampa, joining us once again from New York City. Peter, thank you so much for following this. We've heard now from a couple more people, President Trump a couple times since we last spoke, Vice President Kamala Harris since we spoke. What are your thoughts on some of the messaging still coming out now as people are really reacting to this in the past couple of hours?
Yeah, hey guys, with the initial shock sort of subsiding now, you're seeing the cracks filling in, especially among Democrats. By and large, they're all first gracious that he is taking this step. You haven't heard from many that they're upset that he is doing this. I think a lot of folks knew that this was how this had to take shape. But then you're also starting to see a lot of them, now that he has officially endorsed Kamala Harris, you're seeing others fall in line with that as well, which, again, I know, Ryan, we talked about this earlier, but this is an important moment for Democrats because there has been so much chaos since June 27th. It has been Dems in disarray, to quote the old adage. They need to find themselves in line behind a candidate quickly. And now you do have some folks who are not willing to take that step. We saw that statement from former President Barack Obama, who a lot of people thought was one of Joe Biden's best friends. He didn't fall in line with Joe Biden on this. He did not endorse Kamala Harris in his statement thanking the president for his service. He's in support of an open nominating process. So will that create more chaos among these Democrats, or is that how, frankly, a lot of people feel this has to go in hopes of not disenfranchising the 14 million plus people who voted for Joe Biden and not necessarily Kamala Harris? These, again, are the questions that we need answers to quickly for the Democrats to put all of this chaos to bed.
And, this has been a topsy-turvy election cycle for both parties. Republicans came into the RNC last week with a message of unity. Seems like they all got on board and are heading off in the distance. How quickly do the Democrats need to get behind that same message, and how quickly can they?
Well, yeah, I mean, Ryan, look, if the Democrats are waiting for a month to get to the DNC to hold this open nominating process, that creates a lot of problems for them, frankly. On the campaign trail, big donors, they don't know who their candidate is. The money could dry up. I mean, that's a huge reason that Joe Biden, according to a political strategist I've been speaking to, that's really the reason he had to drop out of this race, is because, yeah, you get these calls from other Democrats to step aside. But once the money stops flowing, you need to really consider not to run. So now, are they going to go through the next month with tentative donors, not really knowing who's at the top of the ticket? Or are they all going to fall in line behind Kamala Harris? Right now, it sounds like the latter. It does seem like that is where the momentum is heading, to back Vice President Kamala Harris, to bring some order to this party right now, because time is of the essence. I think a lot of people would say they don't have a month to come together behind a candidate. They might hold an early nominating process, as folks were kind of mulling over whether to do that for Joe Biden for Ohio ballot reasons initially. And then when they started to see cards falling not in his favor, they thought, hey, let's get ahead of the DNC. Well, maybe they'll consider doing that for Vice President Harris as well before the convention in Chicago, because, again, time is of the essence. They need to calm the fears of not just their Democratic base, but if they want any of these independents to fall in line, they need to start with a concerted, unified message as soon as possible to show them that they're not the party of chaos. They are the ones who have the answers, and the answers are going to come from the top of the ticket, and Kamala Harris potentially.
Yeah, as Ryan mentioned, it seems like Republicans are full steam ahead right now. Democrats still trying to figure out which way they're going to turn. Talk a little bit about what Kamala Harris might have to do in order to get those votes of the delegates, really, at the DNC. What is it that she needs to do? How can she convey this message with only less than maybe a month left until the Democratic National Convention?
Well, first of all, Rashida, I think a lot of folks would say that in her message that she sent out today, saying that she is running, I think she did strike the right tone in saying she plans to earn these votes. She's not some anointed figure in a monarchy. She is still in a democratic system. She's acknowledging that she's not yet the candidate, that this still has to go through a process, but that she wants it and that she wants to earn it. As far as what she needs to do, really, she just needs to portray that strength that I think a lot of Democratic leaders and lawmakers were afraid just was not coming from this White House over the last couple of weeks, whether it be because of President Biden's debate performance, his health, otherwise, they just did not think that there was this concise message of strength being portrayed domestically or abroad. So I think that's what these Democrats really are looking for when they think about who they want to be at the top of the ticket. But we should make it clear, she was on a ticket that did have all these 14 million plus votes. She is the clear frontrunner, the natural successor. Now, that's not how these things work, but you would think she just needs to have a steady voice over the next couple of weeks to assure them that, yes, this is still the presidency and the vice presidency that you voted for. I'm carrying forward with our policies, maybe some more of my own, but this is the ticket you wanted. I'm just the more sure voice right now, representative of that ticket.
And Peter, we know we've been talking a little bit about reaction coming from both sides. Is there anything that you're hearing specifically from some of the lawmakers that you interview? What are they saying? What have you seen and what have you heard over the last maybe few hours that maybe we haven't discussed?
Yeah, I think the interesting side by side that we're seeing is the ones who do endorse Kamala Harris right away and the ones who don't, the ones who are clearly a little unsure. And now one thing I have been looking out for that I really haven't quite seen just yet is anyone outright disgusted by this. Now, you have some folks in the Democratic sphere who have said, hey, you see what you've done, media or other Democrats, you pushed out a great man, a great president, the best that we'll ever see. But as far as actual lawmakers and people who are going to be potential superdelegates or delegates at the DNC, you're really not seeing that frustration. It's just a lot of gratitude. You're not seeing that divide. Again, this has been a huge unifying moment for Democrats. Now it's all about how they can carry forward with this momentum, clearly that is frustrating Republicans. And on the Republican side, as I just alluded to, you do have a lot of frustration. You have people almost as a cop-out for their frustration saying, well, he should step aside if he can't run for president, trying to come up with answers in a really sticky situation for them because they wanted to run against Joe Biden. They saw the numbers that were coming in for President Trump, former President Trump, after objectively a great couple of weeks for him. And now they have a whole new ticket they're going to have to deal with. It'll be a younger ticket. It'll be a more energized ticket, something that I just don't think Republicans want to have to deal with necessarily.
All right. And Peter, I know you've been covering the cases with Donald Trump and the felony case, and talk a little bit about how that's going to play a role. Do you think that's going to make a difference when it comes to, we're talking about a former attorney general that could potentially be running up against former President Trump and potentially debating one another? Kind of what do you make of that situation with someone who is a convicted felon and the former attorney general of a state of California? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, that's a great point, Rashida. She knows how to deal with the justice system in this country. She was also on the Senate Judiciary Committee, one of the stronger voices on that committee. Even as a young Democrat in the U.S. Senate, a freshman Democratic senator, she was still seen as a voice of reason and someone who knew the law of the land in that committee. So yes, during debates, that could be a tough task for Donald Trump. However, in recent weeks, Donald Trump has only gotten good news on his legal cases, He just had one thrown out in Florida. Now that will go through an appeals process, but it will be severely delayed if it ever comes to light. Same thing with the Supreme Court handing down that immunity ruling. Donald Trump now has all these cards in his back pocket that he did not have as I was covering this felony trial for weeks on end, that it resulted in a felony conviction on 34 counts. That seemed like the low point for Donald Trump that day. And now, as far as his legal woes go, he is at a high point with everything coming up. Donald Trump, all of this good news for him. So during the debates, yes, she will inevitably, first of all, if she is at the top of the ticket, we don't want to get ahead of ourselves here, but if she is at the top of the ticket and she is going head to head with Donald Trump, she is not the person that Trump wants to see. But with all of this good news, it could come at a worse time for him.
And Peter, you've seen Republicans attacking this issue from a couple different directions, surprised by their responses and some of the things they're being outward about and saying?
This Democratic elections, this gentleman I've been speaking to is involved in many Democratic elections in the past, said they bring up some good points when you talk about a potentially undemocratic process. Now, that may be a bit of a dramatic framing of what's going to come with the delegates choosing who they want to be at the top of the ticket if they hold an open convention or just a nominating process that takes place before the convention. 14 million people voted in these primaries for Joe Biden. And Kamala Harris on the ticket as well, but they voted for Joe Biden to be at the top of the ticket. So what comes next? If the Republicans are going to frame this as an undemocratic process, that could catch on with some Americans. However, the other side of what they're calling for him to step down because they see him in cognitive decline. And if he can't run for president, then why should he stay in the White House? A lot of folks say there's just zero merit to that kind of claim, that just because he doesn't want to run again at this point. He made no mention of his health yet as a reason for stepping aside or his cognitive abilities. This is strictly a man saying he thinks it's best for the country if he does not run. The reasons still remain. We understand he is going to tell us a little bit more details later this week, but for Republicans to call for him to step aside, it's a bit frivolous in a lot of experts' minds.
Yeah, it seems like that's something that maybe we don't have time for right now. Time is of the essence. We have about 4 months left until the election. So if Republicans do want to focus their time on coming after Biden and asking him to step aside, that'll be interesting to see how they can do that and still juggle a brand new nominee there.
Peter?
Yeah, Rashida, that's right. After today, they're probably going to want to stop talking about Joe Biden and really focus on Kamala Harris. They can keep talking about Joe Biden's policies, the ones they think will be winning issues for Republicans in November, talking about the border, talking about inflation, and trying to tie her to these policies. Another question I actually had for this Democratic strategist I've been speaking to was, what if it's someone who doesn't necessarily have the baggage of the Biden White House that Republicans are using to their advantage? And they said any Democrat that might step into the top of the ticket roll will be tied to Joe Biden because they've all been supportive, for the most part, of his policies. Any Democrat in the land that wanted to run right now would still be tied to immigration policy in this country, economic policy in this country, the things that Republicans are really trying to hit Democrats on. No matter who's at the top of the ticket, it is going to stick to them. So it's about finding someone who's already been on the campaign trail, Kamala Harris, talking about issues that Democrats can win on. Reproductive rights. She's fine-tuned on those fronts in all of these crucial battleground states. Clearly the one who is the successor to Joe Biden. A lot of folks think it makes sense just to go ahead with her. So Republicans are going to want to sharpen their knives when it comes to Kamala Harris specifically, starting 3 hours ago.
Yeah, she's certainly going to be a tough candidate to debate. We know that for sure, being a former attorney general. If she does, in fact, become the Democratic nominee for president, it's something that we're certainly going to be watching. We know you're going to be covering for us, Peter, at the DNC. Peter Zampa, our national correspondent, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet.
We're just now getting word that Vice President Kamala Harris and President Biden have had multiple conversations throughout the day. If you're just tuning in, President Biden has decided to step away from the 2024 election. He has now given his endorsement to Vice President Kamala Harris. They are both on the same ticket. It's something that a lot of Democrats were expecting. Some of them have not been sold, but we know that Kamala Harris has given her statement saying that she needs to earn the vote. She doesn't believe that she is, necessarily going to be already at the top before the DNC. She's willing to earn the delegates' votes. And that's something that we're going to continue to keep an eye on. We're just weeks away from the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where Democrats, they have to get behind someone. If not Kamala Harris, the question is who?
Yeah, exactly. And we'll know a little bit more details before then. We know President Biden is expected to address the nation sometime this week. He said that in that letter that he posted on social media when he stated that he was stepping out of the race. Now, what exactly he's going to say more, not clear. One thing we can say, just to keep the human aspect in all this, President Biden is still recovering from COVID. We got a message earlier this morning from his doctor saying that he's doing much better. He's been on the mend for a couple of days. So keep that in mind, especially while people may have questions on why he posted on social media instead of saying something in general. Just keep that in mind. He is still a human recovering from COVID, but he is doing much better. Keep that on the top of our minds here. But like you said, Rashida, once again, he did announce that he is bowing out of the race. He is stepping aside. He has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris. We've seen other endorsements for Vice President Kamala Harris, and remains to be seen who else's name might be thrown in a hat and how this process will break down, because it can come down a couple of different ways. But obviously those questions are probably being answered in private rooms behind closed doors at the moment, while people continue to make their decision on exactly what's going on. And remember, this is breaking news from Local News Live. I'm Ryan Henson. This is Rashida Kaba here joining me in studio. We've been trying to cover this wall-to-wall coverage. Another weekend here with L&L wall-to-wall coverage. We might bring some cots in here after a while.
I was going to say, just last week, we have to remember the former president got shot. It's crazy to think that 1 week has passed, and this is now the breaking news. Thanks so much for tuning in with us here on Local News Live.
Right. And once again, current President Joe Biden obviously stepping aside now. A lot of people wondering what comes next. We've heard a lot of reaction from Republicans who are weighing in, mainly attacking the situation, saying, hey, if Joe Biden is not fit to run for a presidential election, he is not fit to be in the White House right now. He must leave. Also, them coming after the party as a whole, saying, hey, 14 million Americans voted for Joe Biden, so you're going to betray them and obviously force him off the ticket, in the words of many of the people in the GOP. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more as people return to Capitol Hill after the Republicans were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for the RNC last week, and Democrats probably back home taking a break in their home districts right now. It's going to be an interesting week in Washington coming up, as a lot of business is taking place outside of this news, I can only imagine how much more people are going to be ready for 8 a.m. on Monday, going up to Capitol Hill with a ton of work ahead of them and a ton of interviews, too.
As you mentioned, you have to think he is still the sitting president.
Sure.
He still has 4 months left to serve. So it's going to be interesting to see if this impacts the remainder of his presidency. Is this something that, I know he's had talks with other foreign leaders. You also have Ukraine that's at war right now.
Benjamin Netanyahu is coming to D.C. next week. We're talking about a big week. He's coming to D.C. next week, expected to speak with the president, probably vice president, but for sure President Biden Tuesday, addressing Congress on Wednesday. How that conversation might change now that President Biden, everybody knows, hey, he's going to be out of here in a couple of months. We all know what it's like to have a job and know, hey, I'll be out of here shortly. So if Benjamin Netanyahu gives the same concessions that maybe he was already prepared for, it's going to be interesting with that. At the end of last week, we know that Israel says that, there was a ceasefire deal almost at the finish line. So we'll see how that goes. And once again, this is breaking news from Local News Live. I'm Ryan Henson.
And I'm Rashida Kaba. President Biden has announced he will drop out of the 2024 presidential election and has endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris as a Democratic nominee.
And this comes after Democrats pushed him and his campaign to drop out of the race, fearing his ability to win in November against former President Donald Trump. Now, the president insisted for weeks he would not back down. He said repeatedly he feels he's the best candidate to beat Republican Donald Trump.
Now, the calls for Biden to step aside grew significantly after his dismal debate performance against Donald Trump. Both publicly and privately, several Democrats, more high profile in recent days, called on Biden to drop his re-election bid. Let's take a look at a statement from President Biden earlier today. He said, well, Biden, we do know that Biden took to social media to say that he's stepping down. He says, here, my fellow Democrats, I have decided not to accept the nomination and to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president, and it's been the best decision that I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. That was from President Biden, and that was his second post. I saw on Instagram, I followed it on Instagram. The initial post was that he's dropping out. This very next second post, maybe within minutes, was him saying, I endorse Kamala Harris.
Let's bring in LNL Washington correspondent Josh Rotenberg. He was with me in studio for hours earlier today. He's been following the breaking news. Josh, what did the president's letter say? Go in depth on what you're hearing.
Yeah, good evening, Ryan and Rashida. So President Biden released this letter on X, formerly known as Twitter, at 1:46 p.m., this historic announcement in which he said it was the greatest honor of his life to serve as president of the United States. But he said it was, quote, in the best interest to focus solely on my duties as president. He also added later in that letter that there will be an address coming from him later this week as far as what exactly went into this decision. Obviously, we were all on pins and needles to try to figure out exactly how President Biden made this decision and why, because as you guys have highlighted, for weeks, he has been adamant that he has been staying in this race. But as of today, that's no longer the case.
And Josh, what's the reaction been amongst the Democratic Party? Obviously, they're still trying to come together after all this.
Yeah, so it's really been different tiers of different reaction here. So you've heard from leadership, you've heard from former presidents, you've heard from rank and file members on Capitol Hill in both the House and the Senate. First and foremost, what all of them are saying is that they are thanking Joe Biden ultimately for the legacy that he leaves behind for this one term that he will serve as president of the United States. Now, some taking it a step further and calling him a patriot and saying that he was right to ultimately step aside, and they thank him for that. The third tier of reaction has to do with some of them now endorsing Vice President Kamala Harris to serve as the next president of the United States. Obviously, President Biden did that as well in a subsequent statement that he put out. So with that said, the one thing that we have not heard, whether it's from former President Barack Obama, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, or House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, none of them have endorsed a candidate moving forward here to take over for Joe Biden, even though we are seeing rank and file Democrats on Capitol Hill support Vice President Kamala Harris.
Yeah, as you just mentioned, Democrats saying that he is a patriot, I should say. President Biden is a patriot. That's what they're saying. Kamala Harris, to be the nomination for president ahead of the convention in August, this is a quick turnaround. Talk a little bit about the Republican reaction. Ryan and I have been talking about how this is something that's going to carry with her when it comes to the Biden administration and everything that they have championed. She's not going there not going with any baggage. She's certainly going to be targeted for some of the things that she's passed. Talk about the Republican reaction and kind of how they're targeting Kamala Harris now.
Well, so there's two different reactions, right? Obviously, there's the first reaction to Joe Biden dropping out of the race. And then second, they're going after Kamala Harris because there's widespread speculation that she could be the next Democratic nominee for president. Obviously, she is not that right now, but she could be. First, let's stick with Joe Biden first. You had former President Donald Trump and House Speaker Mike Johnson basically all saying the same thing, that Joe Biden is unfit to run, therefore he is unfit to serve, and that he should not just drop out of the race, but that he should resign from office immediately. There is no sign that President Biden or anybody on his team has suggested that the president do that. Now, as far as Vice President Kamala Harris is concerned, we're already seeing attack ads online on social media going after Vice President Harris, saying that she enabled Joe Biden to get to the position that he's in right now. They have alleged that she has taken part in some quote-unquote cover-up as far as the president's abilities to serve as president. And so with that said, they're going after her. And that's not any surprise. They've gone after her for years while she's been vice president and ultimately potentially as she becomes the next Democratic nominee for president.
And Josh, obviously we're in the land of hypotheticals already. Let's just say, we do go to the convention. It's an open convention. Kind of explain for folks at home how that might work, because that has been an idea that's been floated by high members of, the Democratic Party.
Yeah, look, while there's a number of rank-and-file Democrats that have come out supporting Vice President Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee for president, that is not just automatic. That's not just a done deal. Ultimately, the Democratic delegates that all voted for Joe Biden to be the Democratic nominee, they now have to turn around and do the same for Kamala Harris if she is going to be the nominee. Now, we will see if ultimately in the coming hours and days, if there are any other potential candidates for president that want to step forward, whether they are on Capitol Hill, whether they're in the Biden administration, whether they are current governors around the United States, whether or not they come forward, that all remains to be seen. If everyone unites behind Kamala Harris, then this will be a formality next month in Chicago that all the delegates will likely vote for her. But there's no sign right now that that is the case. Again, we just got done saying that Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and former President Barack Obama have not endorsed Kamala Harris at this moment in time. That could change, but if it doesn't, and this does go to an open convention, then we'll go back to where things were just a couple decades ago, where ultimately, if you were a candidate for president, you had to go to the convention, you had to lobby behind closed doors for delegates to ultimately support you, and then you had to win the majority of delegates. We don't know if that is going to happen, but if it does, that's how everything would work out.
And as we mentioned, Republicans, they're trying to focus on the Biden administration as a whole after this endorsement for Kamala Harris just came down. And we just got breaking news. J.D. Vance just put out a statement. In part, he says she owns all of these failures. She lied for nearly 4 years about Biden's mental capacity, saddling the nation with a president who can't do the job. President Trump and I are ready to save America. Whoever is at the top of that Democratic ticket, bring it on.
Yeah, look, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance is obviously former President Donald Trump's running mate, and so he is going to say, and he's going to stay in lockstep with former President Donald Trump as far as not only attacking Joe Biden and the decision that was made today, but attacking Vice President Kamala Harris, because as of right now, again, there's widespread speculation that she could be the next Democratic nominee for president. And so ultimately, we're going to see what happens in the coming days, but the one thing that is clear when it comes to Republicans, they're unified behind their presidential nominee and their vice presidential nominee, and they're unified against Biden and Harris and this administration and those two as candidates. And obviously, Joe Biden's not a candidate anymore, but Vice President Kamala Harris says that she's throwing her hat in the ring, and so we'll see ultimately if she is the nominee.
That's Washington correspondent Josh Rotenberg once again dipping in with more insight and expertise. Josh, thank you so much. Always appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, guys.
And with President Biden's announcement, the move creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor.
Certainly a quick turnaround, but as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks and how they sealed the president's fate. Molly Martinez has it.
In motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden re-election campaign. To bow out.
The President of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
Now, Biden has made history just months ahead of November's election. The big question now, who will Democrats choose as his replacement at the top of the ticket, and how will this all play out? Amber McReynolds is an American elections expert and independent voter. She was appointed by President Biden to serve as the first woman on the Postal Service Board of Governors. Amber, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, Amber, first off, your reaction to today's news.
Well, goodness, I can't imagine something, an announcement that is more politically courageous, humble, kind, and frankly demonstrates President Biden's enduring legacy and in public service. He has served this country in an incredible way, and I think this further demonstrates his legacy and how much he deeply loves and cares for this country.
Yeah, and I know you're a leading expert on election administration and policy, as well as political conventions. And we're just a few weeks away from the Democratic National Convention. This is going to be an interesting time. Go ahead, walk us through what will happen in the next days, the weeks ahead of the DNC for many of us who have never lived through something like this.
Yeah, well, both the RNC and the DNC have rules in place for not only how they conduct their elections, but how it works up to and leading up to a convention, and what the process for delegate engagement actually looks like. And both parties have processes in place. They have rules in place. And certainly there is a lot going on at the DNC right now as they think through what the next days and weeks ahead will look like. What I think is really important and what is very different about this is the number of unaffiliated voters and independent voters that now exists in the country. We're at about 51% nationally. We have 22 states that still have closed primary processes. So what I think is really going to be important for the DNC to think about is how they create an engaging and enduring process over the next few weeks, so that they can not only engage the delegates, but also engage all of the American people at large in a process that respects democracy, ensures democracy, respects obviously their rules and their procedures, but also creates a vehicle for the American people to have voice and have influence and have a process that engages them and creates civic enthusiasm along the way as well.
And talk about the actual convention. What will Democrats need to do at the DNC in Chicago in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, well, so the convention process obviously exists, and they have rules about how how delegates engage and vote. And interestingly, and I just want to give this piece of history, on the Democratic side, there's been 15 contested or brokered or open conventions, meaning that, they had to have multiple ballots or they had to have a process. And on the Republican side, there's been 9 instances of that in our history. On the Republican side, one of those brokered or contested elections was actually in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln won, and I think it actually occurred in Chicago after three rounds of ballots. On the Democratic side, one of the most significant presidents that came out of a brokered or contested election was actually FDR in 1932 after 4 ballot rounds. So this has happened before. Both parties have rules in place. They're very thoughtful about what those rules look like, and I anticipate that the DNC will be very communicative, not only with the delegates, but with the public at large about what the process will look like. And again, I just hope that it is deeply engaging, deeply thoughtful about how not only to embrace and hear from voters within the Democratic Party, but also think about what their outreach looks like for this 51% of the American public that are now unaffiliated and are going to have a big say in the outcome in November.
Yeah, you just mentioned that brokered convention. There was also one, it looks like in 1952. Talk about the historical context. It's interesting because that one was also in Chicago. This one's going to be in Chicago. Not sure if that's the situation in Chicago, is that we always have a little bit of chaos at the DNC.
They planned it.
Yeah, but talk a little bit about the historic context. I mean, this is going to go down in the history books, and how quickly things need to come together for Democrats.
Yeah, and I think the history here in particular is we've never had 51% of the country be independent, and about 60% of voters under 30 fall in that category. And we still have a lot of states that have closed primaries. So I think what's really important in the days and weeks ahead is for the DNC to be super thoughtful about how they engage delegates, how they encourage delegates to hear from constituencies around the country. And I think it could actually be historic and set a new precedent for how the parties engage with the American electorate. So to me, this is a huge opportunity for the DNC to be super innovative, super thoughtful about that engagement, super thoughtful about how to bring different voices into the process that maybe didn't exist before, and really create the kind of civic enthusiasm that we frankly have never seen in American politics. And, so for me, I think it's just a huge opportunity that they have. At the convention itself, they will have a process like they always do for delegates to cast their ballot. And that will very much depend on what happens in the next few days in terms of which candidates. Obviously, we've already seen Vice President Harris declare that she's going to put her name in. There might be others where we're not sure of what that will look like yet. But as that continues to play out in the next few days, I think it's really important that the DNC just be super thoughtful about how they communicate those rules, how they communicate that process, and how they can create maximum engagement amongst the American electorate, which would set a new precedent for how parties can engage with the electorate at large in this very important process.
And in your experience working elections and as an independent voter yourself, you feel this could be a big moment for independent voters, and explain why.
Well, so given that independent voters have been growing in margin and in veracity over the past few decades, where we're culminating at this moment where more than 51%, according to a recent Gallup assessment, is now 51% of the electorate. And so that's a first time threshold. We've never seen independents grow to be that high. And so I just think it's critically important that both parties think about how those independent voters are going to think about the election come November, but also how the parties adjust what may be their historic and normal processes to engage that very significant, very important group of electors, especially given that 60% of young people under the age of 30 are registered independent, and that's also growing. And so I just think that there's a huge opportunity here for that electorate to be engaged. They are the ones deciding a lot of elections, especially in swing states now going forward. And so, I think whichever major party figures out how best to engage that segment of the population, be super thoughtful about what their perspectives are, and be super thoughtful about how to pull those voices in, to encourage those voices to participate, will be the victors ultimately come November.
Yeah, one thing that we do know is that time is of the essence here. Talk a little bit about the time that we have left as well as the money. So a lot of times people aren't thinking about the campaign funds that went into this election. This is essentially the whole 4 years. If you are going up for re-election, you are raising money during that time frame. Talk about where the money that the Biden administration goes now and how quickly, if there is another Democratic nominee, if it's not Kamala Harris, how quickly that person has to raise the amount of funds that they need to go forward.
Sure. Well, and campaign finance laws are another segment of the election process that have, detailed rules and laws and regulations around them. There's obviously super PACs and political action committees that have been operating. They have a certain set of rules. The campaign itself has another set of rules. So all of the sort of rules and regulations around the money are going to matter greatly, and a lot of that's going to be worked out in the coming days. Often, when you have a presidential campaign, money is not only going from the campaign, but it's also going out to the state parties themselves for their operations and how that all plays out. So I anticipate that there will be a lot more clarity around what some of those things look like in the coming days. And I'm sure there are very smart campaign finance lawyers that are thinking about what this all means in the next few days. And certainly I've already seen a lot of communications today about how much Vice President Harris is raising and has been raising since this announcement was made, and even the Democratic Party itself. So all of those rules and regulations, again, will play out. And, again, those things are kind of one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is the actual running of the election at the convention. And so the delegates are going to need to vote. It will very much, the process itself will very much depend on how many people are in that equation with regards to running for president. And then there's also the VP selection process. And so, again, I think the more engaging, transparent, thoughtful process that can ensue is the best for the American people, because really the DNC, I think at this point, has an opportunity to create tremendous civic enthusiasm, pull more of the electorate in to see the process and be able to hear from whoever might be putting their names forward for both the presidential position, but also the vice presidential candidate. And really, this is a historic moment for sure, given that we are in a technical era too, that allows people to express their voices more quickly and more directly over social media and all of the avenues that we have that didn't exist 50 years ago when we last saw some of these more competitive conventions.
And Amber, I know you, like probably many others, probably could have saw this move coming by President Biden. But is there anything that you're particularly shocked or surprised about now that we're a couple hours into it?
Well, I actually had no idea. I'm not a member of the party. President Biden, you mentioned this at the introduction, he appointed me to be a governor for the Postal Service, which is a presidential appointee, Senate confirmed. I think I'm the first independent that was ever appointed in that role, and I was tapped for my experience, not only working with the Postal Service, but also working as an election official. So, I look at that and think, gosh, I've spent most of my career in public service and just trying to improve the process for everyone. And I thought that President Biden's announcement today really demonstrated a leadership that he has really promoted throughout his entire career in public service. It demonstrated an endearing love for this country and respect for the American people. And I really think that it's a good example of what public service should look like and what political courage should look like for others to follow and emulate. And certainly it's I think a great example for future generations, like my own kids that are 11 and 13. And, I think anytime we can see political leaders put their country first and really be thoughtful about how they see their political future and also their legacy is really important. And this will be everlasting for sure.
Yeah, we know President Biden is a prideful man. So for him to step aside and say, you know what, time is now. I'm going to pass the torch. It's definitely a big move. Amber McReynolds, election expert, thanks so much for joining us and giving us that valuable insight.
Thank you.
And of course, we've been reading these different statements that have been coming into our newsroom. Namely, let's start with Vice President Kamala Harris. She released a statement. We want to read it in full. It says, quote, "On behalf of the American people, I thank Joe Biden for his extraordinary leadership as President of the United States and for his decades of service to our country. His remarkable legacy of accomplishment is unmatched in modern American history, surpassing the legacy of many presidents who have served 2 terms in office."
And she adds, it is a profound honor to serve as his vice president, adding, quote, with this selfless and patriotic act, President Biden is doing what he has done throughout his life of service, putting the American people and our country above everything else. I'm honored to have the president's endorsement, and my intention is to earn and win this nomination. Over the past year, I have traveled across the country talking with Americans about the clear choice in this momentous election, and that is what I will continue to do in the days and weeks ahead. I will do everything in my power to unite the Democratic Party and unite our nation to defeat Donald Trump and his Extreme Project 2025 agenda. We have 107 days until Election Day. Together, we will fight, and together we will win. And this from Vice President Kamala Harris, obviously the main person being endorsed by several leaders in the Democratic Party, including President Joe Biden as the potential nominee.
Yeah, and what's interesting, we talked about that, people trying to say, there are other people that maybe want to come forward and, we have some time until the DNC, but you have to think about those campaign funds.
Yeah.
And luckily for Kamala Harris, the good thing here, the AP is reporting that she already has campaign apparatus in place, already has access to campaign and affiliated group funds. So
that's because her name's on the paperwork, to
exactly. And so that's kind of why a lot of people are saying, let's get behind Kamala Harris. It'll make it a little bit easier for Democrats to be able to come behind one solidified person. There's a lot of technicalities that go into the campaign funds, that go into the DNC. There's a lot of different rules that you have to follow. Not only that, but the next person has to find their vice president in order to be able to get on certain states' ballots.
And technicality, you forgot about the other T word. Time. And time is of the essence. You heard her right there. 107 days until Election Day. Not much time at all to launch a presidential campaign. Now, luckily, like we've just saying, she's already has a head start with the money, head start with the name recognition. So that's why.
Head start with the endorsement from the current president.
Head start with the endorsement from the current president. You've heard a lot of other people prominent in the party as well saying, hey, she's a person we can get behind. So it's interesting. I had to talk to her face-to-face a couple of months ago, back in February, obviously. Still very much a vice presidential nominee, but some of these concerns were still on the minds of Americans. I asked her about it at the time. I asked the vice president if she was ready to take the reins if, for whatever reason, Joe Biden decided to step aside. Here's what she had to say.
I think one of the concerns that Americans have about the age is just older people have, more health issues. It's a real thing. What do you say to those concerns? And specifically, if he had to pass the powers to you for 1 second, 1 minute, heaven forbid, and I ask with all due respect, but, are you capable? Are you ready to step into the role and do whatever the country would need?
Absolutely ready.
All right, you just heard Kamala Harris there saying she is willing and ready to take the reins. Ryan Henson spoke to her back in February, and you said for whatever reason. It didn't matter if it was her stepping in the shoes of the president, the sitting president under this administration, or if it's to be the next president. We've been hearing so many different responses from across party lines. One thing that has remained true, I think, from all the Democrats is that each of them that we've seen that have come forward and given a statement today are saying he's a patriot. He's putting country and service above self. We know how prideful President Biden is. He was asked weeks ago, right after the CNN presidential debate, the disastrous presidential debate, the infamous one, if he would be able to step down. If he was asked by top Democratic officials if he would step down, what he would do. He said he had no plans to step down. He said only if God himself came down and told him to step down would he step down. That's how you know he took this very seriously. And it had to have been something, that came over him that said, you know what, that's what's going to be best for the country. Even his former boss coming out, former President Barack Obama releasing a statement saying, in part, we will be navigating uncharted waters in the days ahead. But I have extraordinary confidence that the leaders of our party will be able to create a process from which an outstanding nominee emerges. I believe that Joe Biden's vision of a generous, prosperous, and united America that provides opportunity for everyone will be on full display at the Democratic Convention in August. And I expect that every single one of us are prepared to carry that message of hope and progress forward into November and beyond. He says, for now, Michelle and I just want to express our love and gratitude to Joe and Jill for leading us so ably and courageously during these perilous times, and for their commitment to the ideals of freedom and equality that this country was founded on.
And for more insight on this whole situation as it develops since about 1:45 this afternoon, Washington correspondent Josh Raltenberg once again joining us here in studio. Josh, I mean, last time we checked in, any new updates? Still, what are you thinking about as you have these conversations and obviously continue to report on this breaking news here?
So the one update that we have taken notice of is one thing that's worth noting. When Joe Biden was still running, obviously this was a ticket that was made up of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and it was the Biden-Harris campaign. And so all of the money that has been raised was under the Biden-Harris campaign. And they've raised north of $90 million right now, or at least I should say that's the cash on hand that ultimately they have. And so always the question is what was going to happen to that money if ultimately Joe Biden did step aside and he was no longer going to be the top of a presidential ticket? Well, we're now learning through the FEC that ultimately Vice President Kamala Harris now has her own group. It is called Harris for President, and she has taken over that war chest that is north of $90 million. It was always speculated that she would have ultimately the inside track to that money. It appears as if right now that she could be taking that over, but obviously we will follow that.
And, we're still trying to figure out who the next Democratic National Convention nominee is going to be. We have weeks away. How quickly, we've talked about this with some of the other people that have come on, how quickly the next person, whoever it may be, as you can hear, you just mentioned Kamala Harris already has that cash on hand because she is already a candidate on that same ticket as Joe Biden. How quickly, if the Democrats do come forward and say, you know what, we want to try something new, how quickly would that person and how capable potentially could they be to get these votes and to get the money that they need to continue this campaign into election 2024?
Well, this is such an unprecedented situation. We've really never seen this before. So ultimately, this is going to be something that we can't rely back on history for to say what exactly could happen. But really, there's only two schools of thought as to what could happen as far as who could be the next Democratic nominee. Number one, that the party simply unites behind Kamala Harris. And before we even get to the convention in Chicago next month, that everybody is just on the same page, that all of the delegates are going to vote for Kamala Harris, and whatever money she raises in between now and then and afterwards, it's all for her and whoever her next running mate is. That's the first case scenario. The other scenario is things just open up. And we haven't seen an open convention for either party in decades. And ultimately, what that would take is for anybody that puts their hat in the ring that's not named Kamala Harris, as she would go against them and would try to lobby some of the delegates in Chicago to vote for that person, and they would need a majority ultimately to be crowned the Democratic nominee. And so we'll see ultimately what happens, but there's 3 or 4 weeks before we get to Chicago, and things are really likely to be decided before then.
And Josh, talk about some of the things that need to be decided. I've talked about unity today. Obviously, it might be a little too early for a running mate, but also, some of these people, everybody get in line. Talk about how important it is for everybody getting on the same page, like the Republicans are, who are full steam ahead after their convention.
Well, you just got done saying it. I mean, if there's one of the two parties that's absolutely united and unified right now, it is the Republican Party. You just saw that in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. For the third straight time, Republicans have nominated Donald Trump to be their nominee. Now, with that said, Democrats have been fractured ever since June 27th, ever since that presidential debate that Joe Biden had, where it was a performance that he would like to have back, that over the course of 90 minutes, he struggled to get out his message. And so ultimately, with that said, Democrats are hoping that today that Joe Biden has dropped out of the race, that there will be some unity. As of right now, they are not completely unified behind one given person, even though we are seeing different lawmakers and former President Bill Clinton coming out and supporting Vice President Kamala Harris to be the next nominee. So we'll see ultimately if they can get on the same page before Chicago and in Chicago, and then obviously after Chicago, because after that you'll have 3 months until November 5th.
Yeah, and while Republicans are full steam ahead, this is a decision that certainly ruffles their feathers as well. Talk about what the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign, I should say, has to do right now in order to pivot in time for the November election and in time for the next debate, really.
So the one interesting thing when it comes to the Trump campaign and Republicans in general, for as much as they bashed Joe Biden and the fact that he was the person going against Trump, what you had been hearing, though, was Republicans were really hoping that Joe Biden did not get out of the race, because ultimately the former president felt that his easiest path to victory was against Joe Biden. Now, could things become easier against somebody else? We're going to have to wait and see ultimately to answer that question. But now we're already seeing attack ads from the Trump campaign and from Republicans in general against Vice President Harris, because she is widely speculated to potentially be the next Democratic nominee for president. So with that said, Republicans are united against Joe Biden, against Kamala Harris, against Democrats in general. And so they're going full speed ahead with their candidate, Donald Trump, and they are confident because they are unified right now that Trump will win re-election. But of course, we'll have to wait and see if that's true.
That's Washington correspondent Josh Rotenberg right there. Josh, thank you so much for dipping in with that insight and information right there. I'm sure we'll see you here in just a little bit.
Thanks for having me.
All right, and we are getting some new information from different lawmakers and different Republicans and Democrats. We just want to read you a few of them. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis weighing in on this new news that President Biden has stepped down from this election 2024 ticket. He accused Harris of being among individuals who weren't honest with the American people about Biden's ability to serve as president. South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem said Biden made the right decision. She also said whoever ends up leading the Democratic ticket will still have to defend Biden's policies. And then North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum, he was a finalist to join Trump on that GOP ticket, if you remember. He called Biden's announcement an early defeat for Democrats. Burgum said, "It doesn't matter which Democrat leads the ticket going forward, because we have President Trump at the top of our ticket, and he is stronger than ever." And of course, former President Trump, coming off of that assassination attempt just last week. It's hard to think that that was last week's news. This is this week's news. We saw Republicans, as you mentioned, full steam ahead at the RNC that just took place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and some of them wearing patches on their ears to show their support for Donald Trump. As you can see, as we just read, Republicans, they are still standing behind their candidate, saying it doesn't matter who you bring forward. We have the guy for the job. We have the guy to unite the country. And that's the question, is whether or not Vice President Kamala Harris is going to be the person to unite the country, or if it's going to be another Democrat.
Yeah, and that's the big question. Obviously, we talked about momentum a lot today. Kamala Harris obviously running with the momentum, as people probably expected her to say. We already read her statement a few times. I'm sure we'll circle back to that again. President Joe Biden gave her an endorsement. Several other prominent Democrats giving her an endorsement. We're about to read a statement from Mark Warner right there of Virginia. Powerful voice within the party. Within that statement, he gives his endorsement to Harris. Like you were saying, Sheeta, though, it's about the money. That's a critical factor. You can't win an election without money. She has her hands on it. Already has, as Josh has enlightened us as well. Moving ahead with that. So, obviously, the Democrats know they can't wait till 3 weeks in Chicago to know what the plan is.
And I think the one thing we can all agree on is that the Biden campaign certainly knows, the Biden-Harris campaign knows how to raise some money.
Right.
Even Donald Trump has criticized it. He said, I don't even know where all that money is coming from. They have so much of it. So that's kind of the front runner. That's another reason why she's the front runner. It'd be the easiest option. It would ruffle the least amount of feathers.
Right. And, Donald Trump also no stranger to raising money. He's raising a lot of money right now, too. Biggest donor right now, at least I can think off the top of my head, Elon Musk said he's going to give him $45 million a month. So, he can't talk too much about thin pockets as well. But obviously, Democrats want to make sure they get the donors back on board, because they had said we're going to freeze all this money for not only Joe Biden, but also for people down ticket as well. That was a big problem and a big pressure thing. That's why you saw a lot of these lawmakers really coming out, really being forced to come out and say, hey, I'm either riding with him or I'm not. And obviously that pressure broke the dam for Joe Biden.
And one of the people that was riding with him, at least in the public eye, was Nancy Pelosi. Pelosi. She is just now giving her statement. She says, in part, President Joe Biden is a patriotic American who has always put our country first. His legacy of vision, values, and leadership make him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. With love and gratitude to President Biden for always believing to the promise of America and giving people the opportunity to reach their fulfillment. God bless America with Joe Biden's greatness and goodness. That was Nancy Pelosi there. As we know, Nancy Pelosi is actually a little bit older than President Biden, but even she has said it is time to hang it up. It's time to step aside. And we know that she stepped aside from her position as Speaker just years ago. So she knows what it's like to have this amount of pride and to be able to say, you know what, this is what's best for the country.
And U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar also reacting now. President Biden has served with integrity and delivered results that will strengthen our country for generations to come. He passed historic legislation investing in our infrastructure, manufacturing, and lowering the cost of prescription drugs. I'm deeply grateful for his service, dedication, and commitment to our country and our democracy. President Biden is choosing the honorable path today, something people have really been calling for.
Yeah, and with President Biden's announcement, the move, it creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor.
But as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks and how they sealed the president's fate. Molly Martinez has a story.
A shaky debate performance on June 27th set in motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden re-election campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came out and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'd get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The president of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now, celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then, the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
You know, President Joe Biden has made history just months ahead of November's election, 107 days to be exact, not much time at all. But the big question now, who will Democrats choose as his replacement, and how will this play out? You know,
I mean, that's a question that all of us have, is how is this going to play out? What comes next? We are just a few weeks away.
I know a lot of people have been reacting, both sides of the aisle. People have different thoughts about what should happen next, how it should happen, thoughts on how things are happening, specifically when we're talking about the GOP. Now, we could have probably guessed that they were going to attack President Biden, saying he shouldn't be in office right now if he can't run for an election. We've heard him say, hey, people voted for Joe Biden, but now all of a sudden he's not on the ticket anymore thanks to pressure by Democrats. So it's been really interesting to see the reactions.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the question, though. Are they going to focus their efforts on attacking Biden, who has now stepped aside? Are they going to focus their attention on Kamala Harris and saying, look, these are all the bad things that your administration that you were a part of already did, and this is why I'm better for the country? Or are they going to focus on their message that was at the RNC, which was unifying the country? That's really the question that I have, is what comes next, just like everyone else.
Right, and we had on Amber McReynolds just a little bit ago talking about, what independent voters are thinking. Because really when it all boils down, it's independent voters and about 7 states who are going to make the difference for the most part if the numbers in the polls stay the same. You know, the blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, where the RNC just was, understandably so, Pennsylvania, places like there. You know, it's independent voters there who are going to sway the election one way or the other. So it's really, what are they thinking? She gave us great insight. You know, she likes the fact that independent voters are getting some power, you know.
She mentioned that she's an independent herself, but she was the first, I believe, independent that was appointed by President Biden in his administration. She talked about this is probably the most independent voters we've ever had in history.
Young, too.
Exactly. Young voters. And a lot of the younger people, they're saying now's the time for change. I think historically we've seen Democrats and Republicans do things a little bit more traditionally. And I think there are a lot more independents now, a lot more free thinkers. People don't want to be tied to a party. They don't like this person's policy. They don't. And what's interesting about this particular year is that at least whenever Biden was still in the race, he and Trump had both been president. So we had something to go off of. It's going to be interesting to see if Kamala Harris distances herself from some of the things or if she just champions them instead.
And it's interesting. I was at the White House literally yesterday, and there was a protest. Obviously, now their questions are answered. They were saying, pass the torch, Joe Biden. That was the whole point of the protest. A lot of young people, probably about 50 people out there, and it was in the rain too, so they weren't out there fair weather. They're out there serious. Hey, Joe Biden, thank you, but it's time to go. That was their message, and they love his record. Like many Democrats have already come out and said, he's done great things, they'll tell you, in his first 4 years, but they say the next 4 are not for you, most importantly, because we can't afford to lose this. That's what Democrats are saying. We can't afford to lose to Donald Trump in November, to turn back all the hard work that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, quite frankly, have done in the past 4 years, and also turn it back from years beyond that. For example, the Roe v. Wade decision, they blame a lot of that on Trump as well. And so we're also hearing from lawmakers across the country, including some Democrat delegates from Tennessee.
Yeah, this includes Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell, who says the move was completely unexpected based on the communications delegates had with the Biden administration leading up to the convention, but that he now supports Vice President Kamala Harris for the presidential nominee.
And Representative Afton Ben says it was the move she was hoping for. She says she wanted to see a new era of leadership and that she supports any female or minority candidate put up for the Democratic Party.
I will say, even coming into this weekend, we were hearing from the administration very active. They remain very active. I was very surprised by it, but I appreciate the president's service to the country, and I appreciate the ways he supported us as a city very, very much.
I'm the only Tennessee Democrat to publicly call for Biden to step down. I welcome the decision, and I'm excited to see what happens in the next few weeks.
Tennessee Democrats held a meeting this afternoon on the heels of President Biden's announcement.
And Vice President Kamala Harris, the woman we've been talking about a lot lately, current vice president, top pick to be nominee, released a statement saying, we want to read it, saying that on behalf of the American people, I thank Joe Biden for his extraordinary leadership as president of the United States and for his decades of service to our country. His remarkable legacy of accomplishment is unmatched in modern American history, surpassing the legacy of many presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
And she adds, it is a profound honor to serve as his vice president. And she continued that statement saying that, she's willing to take on this vice president or this presidential nomination coming up at the DNC, but that she wants to earn the delegates' votes.
Yeah, and that's been a big thing with voters I've been talking to in particular. They say, yeah, Kamala Harris, obviously next up being vice president, but they want someone who can win. And that way they want a little bit more competition. That's something that the DNC hasn't had in the previous election cycles here. I know Peter Zampa here is going to join us here in 1 second. He's in New York. He's joining us back now. He's been with us all day long. And Peter, we're going to have a couple more questions for you. We see Kamala Harris stepping up, obviously saying she wants to be president, already taking over, starting to get her hands on the money that she already has access to some. Talk about how quickly things are moving and how quickly, quite frankly, they need to be moving if Democrats want a chance in November.
Yeah, Ryan, let's dig into all of that. So let's start with the money portion. We already have seen filings that she's started this Biden for President Fund, Biden Baldwin for President Fund, all these different funds. And when you go to click on them, at least a couple of them we know so far, if you click on them, they still say Biden. They don't say Harris. So she's trying to change this, or that gives the appearance that they are just converting this campaign, as was expected, from the Biden-Harris campaign to the Harris whoever she picks campaign. So all those coffers that we know were deep for President Biden will now theoretically transfer over to Kamala Harris. Now, will there be some stink raised from Republicans? A strategist I'm speaking to expects that, and he expects some controversy over just allowing this war chest to transfer over. But it would naturally make sense if some of this was in a political action committee that was headed to Harris anyway, even though as a vice president, it would make sense that it would transfer to her. And if not, there is this idea that they could probably transfer it into another PAC from this one that was under Biden's name. So we already see that in motion. As far as how quickly they need to work, we've been talking about this all day, but it's important for them to show that they are not the party of chaos. And not just to the American people, but also to donors. So that's why this is really a double-edged sword as to how quickly they move. On one edge of this sword, they need to show the American people, specifically the Democrats that voted in these primaries, that this is a fair and free process, that it's just not just going to her, that she's not just anointed by President Biden. All of a sudden, she's the nominee. And she's also made it clear that she wants to earn this nomination. But on the other hand, she needs to earn this nomination quickly. They need to make it clear that they have a ticket, that they're not still waiting for a ticket, to show these big money donors who are starting to dry up for President Biden that they should come back in because they have a true positive ticket that they know will be on the November ballot. So they need to move quick, but not too quick, so as to show that this is an undemocratic process.
Yeah, and since we last spoke to you, we just read Nancy Pelosi's statement. She went on to talk about how President Biden is a patriotic American who always puts our country first, but she did not give the endorsement that maybe a lot of people were looking for Vice President Kamala Harris to step in. Talk a little bit about, weigh in on that. I mean, how big of an endorsement would that be if former Speaker Nancy Pelosi does come forward and say, hey, Kamala Harris is who we need to put our support behind? If Nancy Pelosi or any other top Democratic officials come forward, how big is their endorsement?
Yeah, and former President Barack Obama also did not endorse. And look, if you want to talk more about unifying this party, it needs to happen quickly. But they also, one of the main criticisms they're receiving from the other side of this, and I'm sure will resonate with a lot of Americans, including those Democratic voters in the primaries, is we can't just be picking and choosing our politicians. Conspiracy theories are flying that this was always the plan and that they knew they would be able to get an undemocratically elected Democrat on the ticket in November. They want to try to shy away from that and show that this is a process that will yield the results under the will of the people. However, looking at all of the unification and the support surrounding Kamala Harris right now, the calculation from someone like Speaker Pelosi and someone like former President Barack Obama may be, it's going to be Harris, but we need to make it look like this all happened pretty organically and that she was not just handpicked, even though she is the natural successor. I mean, that's how vice presidents work, and it's how former President Barack Obama's vice president came to be president of the United States. That is generally the pecking order in these things, but they want it to be clear that it's democratically elected and not just chosen by high-up politicians.
Yeah, Republicans, just like Democrats, weighing in on this breaking news that President Biden is stepping aside. Now, one thing I thought was interesting is that, you know, Republicans, they're coming off of the RNC. There's a lot of gusto behind them. Let me just read you North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum. He said, we have President Trump at the top of our ticket. He's stronger than ever. He goes on to talk about how it really doesn't matter who's going to be at the top of the Democratic ballot because they have Donald Trump. Talk about the support that's coming out of the RNC, maybe some of that gusto that's coming fresh off of the RNC that happened in Milwaukee just last week. Talk about the Republican side and how they're not really wavered by whoever comes up on that ticket.
Yeah, so Rashida, objectively from a lot of experts, they thought that the RNC went very, very well. Now, Donald Trump's speech maybe went a little long for some people's liking, but overall, they did see that unified Republican Party that maybe wasn't present earlier this year or even for the last couple of years, ever since January 6th. You saw a lot of fracturing, but right now, it is the most unified I've ever seen this party from covering Capitol Hill. So that tells you something after almost a decade that these folks are together right now. But also after having covered a couple of conventions in the past, Rashida, you always get that bump. So if it was Republicans or Democrats last week, you're always going to get that momentum. And it reflects in the polls as well. It always shows that party, with all the speeches and just a captive audience for a week straight, primetime news, yes, you are going to get that positive bump out of a convention like that. So frankly, for Republicans, this is probably the last time that they wanted to see this announcement come, because they know things could easily shift back in Democratic favor. I mean, it's looking back at past conventions, it's rare that you see the Democrats at the absolute lowest point and Republicans at their absolute highest point at the exact same time. Now, it was luck for the Republicans for it to coincide like that. So for this to kind of shift momentum a little bit back in Democrats' favor, showing that they're no longer in disarray, that they are starting to come behind a clear ticket. And now that hasn't fully happened yet, but it's clear the signs are on the wall that it is hewing that way for Democrats. We'll see if they can really capitalize on this momentum, stealing a little bit of it away from Republicans.
And Peter, we've heard a lot from party leadership on the Democratic side, but how important is it for voters to be a part of this democratic process, especially as whoever the nominee will be, Kamala Harris or otherwise, gets to the top of the ticket?
Well, and I think that's a question viewers are asking themselves right now. I voted for someone, if you were voting in a Democratic primary, and now that person's not doing this and they're just going to choose someone else for me? How does that work? Now, in this situation, it's not like Joe Biden endorsed Gavin Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer, and it's someone that wasn't even in this sphere to begin with, and now all of a sudden they're top of the ticket. This is someone they basically, as a byproduct, did vote for in Kamala Harris, which is why you may see a lot of delegates who are going to the convention feel completely comfortable transferring that vote from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris. But some others might say, no, I really did want Joe Biden at the top of that ticket, and I did not count on Kamala Harris being the president of the United States potentially. So I think we should do all of this over again. These are legitimate questions that could lead to an open convention and are likely why you have people like Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi kind of pulling back a little bit. They want to see this happen organically. Now, again, the organic result of this right now appears like it would easily be Kamala Harris, given how widely respected she is in the Democratic Party and how much support she clearly has from leaders top to bottom on Capitol Hill and elsewhere.
All right, Peter, we're just getting breaking news that Kamala Harris is officially a nominee for President of the United States. We want you to react to this. Tell us a little bit about, just the reaction. I mean, it
comes
hard
in minute by minute.
I mean, it's coming in. It's hard to believe that this is the day that we're in, but talk a little bit about that. Now she is officially.
So you're just breaking this news to me now. I think I need more information before I do comment on that. How did they go through this nominating process? Let me turn it back on to you.
Yeah, and so just to give you more information, the letter is to inform you. I'm just going to read it kind of as we're getting it right now. This letter is to inform you that Vice President Kamala Harris is no longer a candidate in the 2024 election for vice president. Vice President Harris is now a candidate for U.S. president in the 2024 election and will henceforth be conducting campaign activities only in pursuit of that office. This committee statement of organization and the statement of candidacy are being amended accordingly. I know, Peter, we were talking earlier today about how fast she was getting her hands on the money. I mean, Peter, you were saying it. The website can't even change as fast as they're moving, trying to get access to the funds to continue to hit the ground running, literally, as they try and catch up to the Republicans and Donald Trump. Talk to people about how fast this process is going to move, even though it is incredibly complex.
It really is. And we saw her filings with the FEC earlier, just a few minutes ago, hours ago. Again, time doesn't exist right now, but this is moving very quickly. And, it could move quicker than this as far as the days preceding this, because Joe Biden, until yesterday, was saying he's in this. He wants to fight and win this still. But as of now, Kamala Harris had to move very quickly. She may have had things in order depending on when she was actually notified of this move and notified of President Biden's support for her. But as soon as that happens, again, time is of the essence, Ryan and Rashida. We've been talking about this. They need to move quick because their campaign season is shortened. And that's really why any outsider that was hoping to get in this who may not have the name recognition really did not make sense, especially getting into a race when all the momentum was on the other side. it's a really difficult task for anyone but Vice President Kamala Harris, now presidential candidate Kamala Harris. So yeah, she wants to get those filings underway for legal reasons, for monetary reasons, and to show those donors that she is a candidate for president. But that's not to say someone else might not emerge. It does not appear likely at this point. But right now, Kamala Harris clearly full speed ahead, and now she'll have to get her team together, likely stealing people from the Biden team, maybe a few of her own personal team members in there who have been doing a lot of work for her to make sure that this campaign is a well-oiled machine and continues to rake in the cash that we've seen President Biden do very successfully this cycle.
Yeah, I mean, weigh in a little bit. You know, this comes at an inopportune time for President Biden as he has COVID. Earlier this week, we had breaking news that he had COVID. And a couple weeks ago, Hunter Biden found guilty of federal charges. He purchased a gun while being an addict. He was convicted of that. How much of a role do you think family had in Biden saying, you know what, I'm going to step aside. I'm 81 years old. He's, I'm sure, sick. He's been quarantined or whatever he's doing at this moment. But talk about how much family may have played a role in this decision for him.
Well, Rashida, I'll even turn that on the other side. Family reportedly was one of the reasons he was staying in this race, because his wife thought he could do this, that he was a great president and that he could be a great president for another 4 years. Now, the political winds were really blowing against him. So it's not clear how much family actually had to do with this. Of course, his son's legal woes are an issue that will, by the way, no longer be an issue on the campaign trail. That's something Republicans are probably not happy about. But yes, he is getting older, and he can clearly see that the walls were closing in on him, not necessarily health-wise, but politically for sure. And again, we cannot stress this enough. It's one thing to hear these voices, and it's another thing to see the dollar signs start to go away. And that was the trend, and that is an unsustainable trend in big politics, especially consider how much money he was bringing in for so much of this cycle, leading Donald Trump by a lot. Donald Trump had all of these financial problems. He was going to have to figure out how to pay off his legal woes, all of these different things. He was struggling financially. And now things are completely changed for the Republicans. It was almost like they just went in complete opposite directions. That's not sustainable for Democrats. Everything is already in Donald Trump's favor right now. They could not afford to keep losing big donors. So getting a ticket that is a sure thing for Democrats, they know what they're going to get. They know what to expect. A younger ticket, a more energized ticket, one that might do better in a second debate against Donald Trump. That is exactly what they needed to show politicians, but also mainly those big donors.
That's LNL Senior National Correspondent Peter Zampa. Peter, thank you so much. I know you've covered Congress, D.C., the White House, and everything for years, so your expertise is very much appreciated.
Thank you.
And we're just going to recap now that we're at the top of the hour, just the breaking news we've been covering since about 1:46 p.m. this afternoon. President Joe Biden stepping out of the 2024 election. I'm Ryan Henson.
And I'm Rashida Kaba. President Biden has announced he will drop out of the 2024 presidential election and endorse his vice president, Kamala Harris, as the Democrats' nominee. Just moments ago, the Federal Election Commission says Harris now is a candidate for United States president in the 2024 election.
And this comes after Democrats pushed him and his campaign team to drop out of the race, fearing his ability to win in November. The president insisted for weeks he would not back down. Even on Friday, he said after he gets over COVID this weekend, he was going to be campaigning tomorrow on Monday. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. He said repeatedly he feels he's the best candidate to beat Republican Donald Trump. Now he's got to turn the reins over.
Yeah, the calls for Biden to step aside grew significantly following his dismal debate performance against Donald Trump in that CNN presidential debate. Both publicly and privately, several Democrats, more high profile in the recent days, have called on Biden to drop his re-election bid. Here's a statement from President Biden earlier today. Take a look at it. And the Biden campaign, he talked a little bit about it on X. That's where the news broke.
He posted that letter on X.
It kind of shows you the times that we're in right now. And he went on to say, you know, he's thankful that he's had this time in the White House and that he's done his best and that he continues to do his best for the American people, but that he's going to step aside.
Yeah, here's a statement that he said. My fellow Democrats, I have decided not to accept the nomination and to focus all my energies on my duties as president for the remainder of my term. My very first decision as party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president, and it's been the best decision I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. So obviously, you know, after that announcement right there, the move creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a successor, even though Kamala Harris seems to be in the front runner seat right now and she's officially in it.
Yeah, but as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks. We know there have been many, and how they sealed the president's fate. Molly Martinez has the story.
Performance on June 27th set in motion a series of events that destabilized the Biden re-election campaign. In an effort to do immediate damage control, 1 week later, the president agreed to a sit-down interview with George Stephanopoulos.
If the Lord Almighty came out and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'd get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
The interview did little to quell the growing anxiety in the party, with several congressional members calling for the president to bow out.
The president of the United States doesn't have the vigor necessary to overcome the deficit.
Now, celebrities were getting involved, with friend and mega donor George Clooney penning an op-ed in the New York Times that the president was unfit to serve another term. On July 11th, following the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., the president put himself in the hot seat, hosting his first ever solo press conference in 8 months. The attempt to show off his acumen for foreign policy was eclipsed by this gaffe.
I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
The redemption tour continued, despite a growing chorus of members of his own party calling for a replacement. Then, the event no one could have predicted. This stunning, pivotal moment catapulted support for Donald Trump and forced many to take an even harder look, not just at Joe Biden's viability as a candidate, but the survivability of the party with important congressional and Senate races at stake. In the days after the attempted assassination, reports grew of high-ranking Democrats, including Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi and former President Barack Obama, asking for intervention. These calls were heated, with Biden announcing it's time to pass the torch. We're still a month out from the DNC, where the party faces a reckoning of identity and leadership. In Washington, I'm Molly Martinez.
Now, Vice President Kamala Harris released this statement saying, quote, on behalf of the American people, I thank Joe Biden for his extraordinary leadership as president of the United States and for his decades of service to our country. His remarkable legacy of accomplishment is unmatched in modern American history, surpassing the legacy of many presidents who have served 2 terms in office.
She adds, it is a profound honor to serve as his vice president. And joining us now is White House correspondent John Decker. John, we've had some new developments since we last spoke. The Federal Election Commission now saying that Kamala Harris has officially started to run for president of the United States. What's your reaction to this?
Well, it's not surprising. That's dotting the I's and crossing the T's. You can't just make an announcement outwardly without taking these formal steps. The formal steps have now been taken. And this is important. It's important in several ways. It's important, most importantly, in terms of fundraising. It's an important aspect of any presidential campaign. You could even argue it's the most important aspect of the presidential campaign. This will allow the Biden-Harris campaign to transfer funds to the Harris for President campaign, and it will allow the process to go forward as far as fundraising and fundraisers are concerned. The Vice President has a lot on her plate right now. She needs to unify her party. She needs to do that fundraising, which is so important. And she needs to make certain that she has a viable, strong running mate in terms of winning in these key battleground states. That's a lot on the plate with 107 days to go until November the 5th. That's Election Day.
And John, I know we talked a lot today about momentum, her moving so quickly, especially, putting her name on the paper and getting her hands on the money and putting out statements. How much does that mean in terms of her being the nominee at the end of the DNC in Chicago next month?
Oh, it's so important. 3 weeks away, that's when the Democratic National Convention in Chicago gets underway. And you really want to make certain that all of your ducks are in a row before that convention begins. And we'll see if indeed that happens. And I say if indeed that happens, because although you have President Biden endorsing the vice president, you have Bill and Hillary Clinton endorsing the vice president to be the Democratic standard bearer, you don't have former President Barack Obama endorsing Kamala Harris just yet. In fact, he put out a statement essentially saying that he would like to see an open primary process during the convention to determine who the standard bearer for the Democratic Party will be in November.
And John, her moving so quickly, does that effectively ice out anybody else who could throw their name in the hat? Or is there still time and to see that open convention like former President Barack Obama wants to see?
Ryan, it's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. No one knows the answer to that. There are so many individuals within the Democratic Party who do have presidential ambitions. Think about it this way, Ryan. Think about all the Democrats that ran in 2020. All of them still have those same presidential ambitions. And the question is, do any of those sitting Democratic governors, do they put their ambitions aside and coalesce around Kamala Harris? We'll have to wait and see over the next 24 to 48 hours. They need to get their ducks in a row if indeed they're going to challenge her. Make certain that they have the fundraising apparatus in place, that they have the campaign apparatus in place, because it's now essentially going to be subsumed by the Harris for President campaign. And so as a result, she has that head start in terms of those key endorsements coming from President Biden, from former President Bill Clinton, from Hillary Clinton. These are the leaders of the Democratic Party.
One thing that we've noticed that has been the same tune for a lot of Democrats is them saying, President Biden is a patriot. He's putting service and country above self. Talk about the legacy that he leaves behind after he leaves office come November. He's passed a lot of bills. He's helped a lot of people. We can't ignore that. Talk about the legacy the Biden-Harris administration has.
Well, he does have a legacy. He was successful in passing some meaningful, long-lasting legislation. You think about the bipartisan infrastructure law that was signed into law in the first year of President Biden's time in office. That is one of those legacy items, because those projects, those infrastructure projects, will be going on long after President Biden leaves office. You have, in addition to that, a Supreme Court justice who potentially will be on the U.S. Supreme Court for decades. That is a lasting legacy item. The CHIPS Act, also important as far as trying to continue on with economic policies which would benefit the tech sector in America. So certainly President Biden does have substantial accomplishments that he can point to during the course of his 4 years in office. That being said, those accomplishments were not enough to stop the onslaught of Democrat after Democrat in Congress from calling on him to step aside, to bow out of the race to be the Democratic nominee this election cycle.
And you mentioned it a little bit, you touched on it briefly, when it comes to other nominees that could come forward outside of Kamala Harris. Talk about some of the difficulties they could potentially face outside of money, as we are just 3.5 weeks away from the Democratic National Convention.
Well, Rashida, it is often said that money is the mother's milk of politics, and it's true. You can't simply throw your hat in the ring and hope that money follows your candidacy. You have to have that fundraising apparatus in place. And there are very few candidates who would potentially challenge the vice president who have that kind of apparatus, a national campaign fundraising apparatus in place. There's Gavin Newsom of California. He potentially has that right now, but it's one of those things where how do you challenge the person who right now has this head start, the sitting vice president? And let's not forget, She's from California, like Gavin Newsom is from California. That would be very interesting if indeed that occurred. I think what is likely to happen, leaving aside what President Barack Obama has decided to do, leaving him out of the picture just for a moment, I think that what we're likely to see is a coalescing of the Democratic Party around Kamala Harris's candidacy. And that would mean that the real focus, I believe, over the course of the next week will focus on who would be a very strong running mate for the vice president to help in these key battleground states, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada. Those are the states which will determine who wins the White House in 2024.
And John, you know, if former President Joe Biden, well, not former President Joe Biden, he's still current president, President Biden campaigns for Kamala Harris, let's say she is the nominee, would that help or hurt her, especially given that Democrats, for the most part, really love what he's done the past 3.5 years, and Republicans seem to be absolutely hating it? What will it do if he went to the campaign trail to help her?
Well, that's a great question, Ryan. I don't know the answer to that. I never viewed President Biden as a particularly great campaigner. To me, the best campaigner in the Democratic Party is former President Barack Obama. He is a successful two-term president. We saw how hard he worked in the last election cycle, even with the pandemic going on, campaigning for President Biden in Philadelphia, in Atlanta, in Milwaukee, in Madison, Wisconsin. These are the important places to get out the Democratic vote. And so he will be critical in terms of helping out the vice president, if indeed she is the nominee, and it looks like she likely will be in November.
All right, John, we know you are traveling. White House correspondent John Decker, we appreciate you taking time out of your travel to give us some really valuable insight here on this very momentous day in Washington, D.C.
Thanks, Rashida.
So as we continue to cover this breaking news of President Biden stepping out of the 2024 race, we talked a lot about Democrats, talked a lot about who's next, but people in the GOP have plenty to say, including his political rival, Donald Trump. Trump campaign released a statement. I'll read it right here. Joe Biden, quote unquote, cannot take himself out of a campaign for president because he is too mentally incompetent and still remain in the White House. Biden is a national security threat in great cognitive decline and a clear and present danger to every man, woman, and child in our country. The question then to Kamala Harris is simple. Knowing that Joe Biden withdrew from the campaign because of his rapidly deteriorating condition, does Harris believe the people of America are safe and secure with Joe Biden in the White House for 6 more months?
Of course, Donald Trump not taking any words, not sparing any words. Of course, we wouldn't expect anything less. And we know his vice presidential running mate, J.D. Vance from Ohio, he's also weighing in on all of this. He shared this. He said, Joe Biden has been the worst president in my lifetime, and Kamala Harris has been right there with him every step of the way. Over the last 4 years, she co-signed Biden's open border and green scam policies that drove up the cost of housing and groceries. She owns all of these failures. She lied for nearly 4 years about Biden's mental capacity, saddling the nation with a president who can't do the job. President Trump and I are ready to save America, whoever's at the top of the Democrat ticket. Bring it on. You can hear there's still some words that are going around. They're not happy that I don't think that Kamala Harris is coming forward, but they're saying this is no different. We're not going to change our game plan. This is the exact same game plan that we came in to beat the Biden-Harris administration.
I mean, I think they're using it the same way Democrats are. Democrats trying to rally around a candidate. You've heard a lot of people endorse Kamala Harris. Republicans saying, hey, this is a chance for us to attack Democrats, attack the party, attack Joe Biden, as he has just now, we know, a couple more months left in office, attack Kamala Harris, who's trying to win 4 more years, and attack the party as a whole, saying, hey, they don't know what they're doing. We do. Trust us. We're the guys to help save America, quote unquote. And, you know, it's politics. That's exactly what they're doing.
If you're just joining us, you know, the breaking news that has come down, we've had many different aspects of this breaking news, starting off with around 1:45. President Biden saying, you know what, I'm going to step out of election 2024, and I am now going to pass this on to my vice president, Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris has officially begun running for president. According to the Federal Election Commission, they have said she's no longer a vice presidential candidate, but a presidential candidate. And we've seen so many different lawmakers come forward on the Democratic, Republican side weighing in on this. Trump is still the GOP's candidate. They're saying we don't care who comes at the top of that ballot, we're going to beat them. And, you know, a lot of people on Biden's side are saying, you know what, regardless, we need to rally behind one person. The easiest person that would be to rally behind, Kamala Harris, being that campaign funds are in her favor.
And, you know, we're taking a live look right now at the calm outside of the White House. I can only imagine how frantic it is on the inside right there. But let's talk about the inside of Joe Biden's family right now. We're getting reaction from Hunter Biden, who we all know is his son, and he's awaiting sentencing after recently being convicted of a felony gun charge. So the president's son said his father is a quote unique figure in public life and asked Americans to thank him. Hunter Biden also goes on to say that the president's unconditional love, quote unquote, has been a North Star for his father as president and as a parent, and that there is no distance between the two. He said he's lucky that he gets to tell his dad every day that he loves him and to thank him. He asked the public to join him in doing the same. And I think that sentiment of thank you, Joe Biden, echoes really across the party. I told you I was out there yesterday with protesters who wanted Joe Biden off the ticket. The first thing they said was thank you, Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Then they said, get off the ticket.
Yeah.
You know, the one thing a lot of these Democratic lawmakers are coming out and saying, I know they're not using Kamala Harris's name or not, but the one thing they are using, thank you, Joe Biden. So Democrats obviously in full support of Joe Biden, the work he's done over the past 3.5 years, and the rest of the work he's going to do for the next couple of months while he remains in the White House.
Yeah, and we're all standing by. We're getting word that President Biden is going to be addressing the nation at some point this week. We don't have a specific timeline, but we can only imagine what he's going to say. I'm sure he will talk about, you know, the successes that he's had, the legacy that he leaves behind, his endorsement for Kamala Harris.
Right.
You have to expect that those are some of the things that he'll address.
And remember, you know, to keep this in human terms here, Joe Biden is recovering from COVID right now. He's been recovering for the past couple of days. Obviously, we know how COVID impacts older adults. So the doctor this morning said he is doing much better today, but obviously this is some weight off his shoulders nonetheless.
Yeah.
But Republicans are saying, hey, we're going to take this time to go after the Democrats, like we're saying. Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson saying in part, quote, having invalidated the votes of more than 14 million Americans who selected Joe Biden to be the Democrat nominee for president, the self-proclaimed party of democracy has proven exactly the opposite. The party's prospects are no better now with Vice President Kamala Harris, who co-owns the disastrous policy failures of the Biden administration. As second in command and completely inept border czar, Harris has been a gleeful accomplice not only in the destruction of American sovereignty, security, and prosperity, but also in the largest political cover-up in U.S. history. She is known for as long as anyone of his incapacity to serve. That is House Speaker Mike Johnson, who's interesting enough coming with the stinging words, especially as someone who's a leader of the GOP. But if you remember back in the fall, when the roles were reversed, Republicans in disarray, we don't know who's going to be House Speaker. Mike Johnson was selected because he was seen as the most divisive, the least divisive out of all the other candidates who are throwing their names in the hat. Now he's definitely using this opportunity to come on, play politics some, but also call out something that other people, even some pundits to a degree, have echoed that, hey, Joe Biden's name was at the top of the ticket. No,
a lot of people in that CNN presidential debate, what's being known as the disastrous debate, that's when a lot of people have said, hey, wait a minute. We have been hearing these talks of Biden's decline, but none of you guys confirmed it. Some people kind of angry about it, saying, hey, you tricked us.
Right.
Now we're in this type of situation, and it's August. We're just months away from the November election, and it is difficult to pivot. Of course, in years past, back in the day, they used to wait until the Democratic National Convention to come out and say, this is our nominee. Of course, what we're used to in our lifetime is having somebody we know who's going to be at the DNC, and we know who's going to be running. This, very different.
Right. Our local journalists across the country are following this breaking news today and in South Carolina.
Yeah, that's where our station WIS hit the streets to hear from voters about their reaction to President Biden's decision. Here's what some of them had to say.
I was honestly really shocked. I didn't see that coming. I wanted it to come. I feel like it's, you know, not for any like policy reasons or anything, just because he's getting older. And, you know, the way he was acting during the debate was kind of insane.
Cool to see other ideas and other philosophies from other Democratic Party members. But I do think it's so close to the election that it really doesn't matter what happens. I think Trump's going to come home with it.
I think it's time to see someone new. I think it's time for them to take a step back and allow other people to be in the running with fresh ideas and better initiative.
You just heard it there. Some voters wanting another option, saying somebody should come in with some fresh ideas. We're also hearing from lawmakers across the country, including some Democratic delegates from Tennessee.
This includes Nashville Mayor Freddie O'Connell, who says the move was completely unexpected based on the communications delegates had with the Biden campaign leading up to the convention, but that now he supports Vice President Kamala Harris for the presidential nomination.
Representative Afton Ben says it was the move she was hoping for. She says she wanted to see a new era of leadership and that she supports any female or minority candidate put up for the Democratic Party.
I will say, even coming into this weekend, we were hearing from the administration very active. You know, they remain very active. I was very surprised by it, but I appreciate the president's service to the country, and I appreciate the ways he supported us as a city very, very much.
I'm the only Tennessee Democrat to publicly call for Biden to step down. I welcome the decision, and I'm excited to see what happens in the next few weeks.
As Tennessee Democrats held a meeting this afternoon on the heels of President Biden's announcement.
Now, members of Biden's cabinet are praising the president's legacy and his administration.
Yeah, so are many voters. Education Secretary Miguel Cardona said Biden fought to ensure that education is accessible and affordable for all students in communities across the nation.
Meantime, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said Biden has earned his place among the best and most consequential presidents in American history. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said she was proud of the work in the administration and accomplished citing new jobs and economic growth.
Interior Secretary Deb Haaland said the administration had achieved transformational and historic change.
And with President Biden's announcement, the move, it certainly creates a vacuum in the Democratic Party with fewer than 5 months to crown a new successor.
But as politics play out on the national stage in real time, we wanted to take a look back at the events of the last 3 weeks and how they sealed the president's fate. Our Washington correspondent Molly Martinez has this report.
A shaky debate performance on June 27th set in
She's been my friend not just for a few years, but for a decade. But I think she means it when she says she's not a candidate for any office this year.
Vice President Harris is scheduled to campaign in Wisconsin, Indianapolis, and Massachusetts this week. Tonight, the chair of the Biden campaign told all staff during a call that Harris is the nominee. Nora.
All right, Weijia Zhang outside the U.S. Naval Observatory where the vice president lives. Thank you. And we'll have more of our special coverage of this extraordinary day in American politics. Stay with us.
Reminder, bent finger appointment. I don't want to wait or have surgery for my Dupuytren's contraction. I want a non-surgical treatment.
And if non-surgical treatment isn't offered?
I'll get a second opinion.
Take charge of your treatment. If you can't lay your hand flat, visit findahandspecialist.com to get started.
With generative AI on AWS, companies are already transforming how they work to generate new ideas and turn experiments into reality. AWS is the easiest way to get up and running, so you can quickly build and scale generative AI with security built in. With generative AI on AWS, businesses can push the boundaries of innovation.
Someone needs to customize and save hundreds with Liberty Mutual. Wait, there's an elevator? Only pay for what you need. Liberty, 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 liberty. Wait, there's an elevator? Only pay for what you need. Liberty, 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 liberty.
This is what joint pain looks like when you keep moving with Aleve. Just one Aleve, 12 hours of uninterrupted joint pain relief. Aleve, strength to last 12 hours.
For people who feel limited by the unpredictability of generalized myasthenia gravis and who are anti-AChR antibody positive, season to season, Ultomiris is continuous symptom control with improvement in activities of daily living. It is reduced muscle weakness. And Ultomiris is the only long-acting GMG treatment with the freedom of just 6 to 7 infusions per year for a predictable routine I can count on.
Ultomiris can lower your immune system's ability to fight infections, increasing your chance of serious meningococcal infections, which may become life-threatening or fatal, and other types of infections. Complete or update your meningococcal vaccines at least 2 weeks before starting Ultomiris. If Ultomiris is urgent, you should also receive antibiotics with your vaccines. Before starting Ultomiris, tell your doctor about all of your medical conditions and medications. Ultomiris can cause reactions such as back pain, tiredness, dizziness, limb discomfort, or bad taste.
Ultomiris is moving forward with continuous symptom control. Ask your neurologist about starting Ultomiris.
Pause for the facts. Susie here is shopping for a used car, but she doesn't know that nearly half of them have been in an accident.
Interesting.
But Carfax.com shows how accidents impact price, so she doesn't have to overpay. Unpause.
Whoa.
Shop the all-new Carfax.com.
The news today has reverberated around the world. President Biden is dropping out of the campaign, significant for so many reasons, including that there are only 107 days until Election Day. No president has ever left the race so late in the campaign cycle. Every newspaper headline blaring the news from Seattle to New York to Mumbai, and every television station from coast to coast tuned to the news, with millions watching the headlines, are clear. The news and what it will lead to is extremely uncertain. We're going to have more on what this means for the Democratic Party and for the nation coming up as our special coverage continues on the CBS Evening News.
When breaking news happens, 19 News is there first, asking fair questions to tell the whole story, everywhere, with coverage that goes beyond your TV screen. That's why 19 News is Cleveland's breaking news leader. 19 News, sponsored by the man that makes them pay, Tim Misney. First, fair, everywhere. 19 News, your breaking news leader, starts now with a breaking news alert.
Breaking as we come on the air, America in uncharted territory as President Joe Biden makes the historic announcement that he's stepping away from the presidential race and supporting Vice President Kamala Harris as a Democratic nominee. Good evening. I'm Caitlin McCarthy. The president's decision came amid growing pressure from many in his party, including Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown, after last month's disastrous debate performance. CBS's Natalie Brandt has the breaking details.
President Biden has dropped his bid for re-election. In a statement, the president said in part, quote, "While it has been my intention to seek re-election, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and to focus solely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term." His change of heart comes 1 month ahead of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Jamie Harrison is the chair of the DNC.
I am emotional about the president's decision because this president, Joe Biden, has been a transformational president. He's been a great leader. He's a good man, a decent man who has done so much for this nation, but so much to see us as people, to value us, to fight for us.
In his statement, President Biden says he's offering his full support and endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris to become the Democratic presidential nominee. Former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton are also backing Vice President Harris. By this weekend, more than 36 Democratic lawmakers had called for the president to exit the race following last month's debate. Delaware Senator Chris Coons, one of the president's closest allies and co-chair of the Biden-Harris campaign, called this a critical moment in American history.
This was a very difficult decision, and one that I think reflects the very best of who Joe Biden is. The challenge of seeing this moment and of recognizing what was in the best interest of the nation was a significant challenge. I still believe he could have beaten Donald Trump, but I also know that what he's done today is in the best interests of our nation.
President Biden made the decision while recovering from COVID-19 at his home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, where voters say they support the move.
I think he made the right decision. I think it was very brave of him.
I just think it's a little shocking at this stage of the game with, 13 weeks left until an election. I think that a lot of people knew there was going to be some big issues here for a long period of time.
The DNC says in coming days, the party will undertake a transparent and orderly process to move forward as a united Democratic Party. Natalie Brand, CBS News, the White House.
And Trump texted this message to CBS News, quote, Kamala Harris owns the entire left-wing policy record of Joe Biden. The only difference is that she is even more liberal and less competent than Joe, which is really saying something, end quote. A mix of emotions tonight, even from those who pushed for this to happen. Ohio Senator Sherrod Brown releasing a statement saying, quote, I thank President Biden for his years of committed service to the country we love, as senator, as vice president, and as president, end quote. Ohio Governor Mike DeWine posting on X today, quote, I have known President Biden since 1995 when I entered the U.S. Senate and served with him on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Fran and I wish President Biden and the First Lady all the best as he serves out the remainder of his term and in the years ahead, end quote. And Cleveland Mayor Justin Bibb responding to Mr. Biden's decision by saying, quote, thank you, Mr. Biden, for being a champion for Cleveland, America's cities, and our democracy during your presidency and over your entire career. Now, with President Joe Biden dropping out of the presidential race, local political science experts explain what the top concern may be and how soon Democrats could pick their nominee.
I think the first concern is how do you get somebody else to be the nominee who then has to turn around and pick a vice presidential nominee, which will also happen at the convention? And how do you come out of that 4-day convention with those two people in hand and a strong united front of Democrats who will work for those candidates in the same way that we saw coming out of the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee?
The Democrats may pick their nominee officially on August 1st through a virtual roll call, or they may decide, if it looks like the party has coalesced around Kamala Harris as the nominee, the party may decide simply just to go to the convention and do a conventional roll call, because after all, that'll make for much better television and it'll be much more historic.
The Democratic National Convention is scheduled to start August 19th in Chicago. President Biden has backed Vice President Kamala Harris for the nomination. We continue our team coverage with Michelle Nix, who joins us from the Cuyahoga County Democratic Party headquarters with reaction to this breaking development. Michelle, what are you hearing from voters tonight?
President Joe Biden is doing what he feels is best for the country, and they say that it should have come sooner, but they say this is a real test for the Democrats.
Understands the gravity of his situation, and I fully support him if that's the decision he thinks what's best for the country.
About time. I don't know who they're going to pick, but he was not the right choice, and I think he knew that 4 years ago.
I think maybe what he did was right, but I don't really know, to be honest with you.
Well, I'm a Trump supporter, so I kind of want Biden to stay in the race because I thought Trump had him. I feel like the Democratic Party was the party of democracy, but it seems like they're against their own candidate.
Now, President Biden is focused on finishing his term with his Vice President Kamala Harris, and many feel that she is the natural person to step into the new role as nominee. But many say we will see how this all breaks down, because the Democrats have a lot of work to do in just a few months. Reporting live from the Democratic headquarters, Michelle Nix, 19 News.
And you can count on 19 News for continuing coverage as this story develops in the coming days and weeks. Anytime news breaks, you can find it first on the 19 News app.
Now your 19 First Alert forecast, certified most accurate since 2004.
The 19 First Alert team tracking the possibility of some thunderstorms this week. Chief Meteorologist Jason Nicholas has the new data in the First Alert. And Jason, we definitely need some rain.
We do. We're in a moderate drought. We'll get new drought numbers later this week. But between now and then, we do have some, Caitlin, rain chances. Nothing out there.